At my divorce hearing, my wife smiled like she had already won the lottery. She sat there in her conservative Sunday dress, looking like the perfect victim. Then my daughter stood up. She walked to the front of the courtroom, played a hidden video, and whispered, "Dad, she made me record everything." The judge froze my wife's $6 million plan before she could even squeeze out a single fake tear. But to understand how a father and daughter ended up setting a trap in a federal courtroom, you need to know how the ultimate betrayal began on what was supposed to be the happiest weekend of my life. My name is Tom Miller. I am 68 years old. If you look at my hands, you will see 40 years of thick grease baked right into the deep creases of my skin. My knuckles are permanently swollen, and my lower back screams in agonizing pain every single time it rains here in suburban Ohio. For 4 decades, I poured every ounce of my blood, sweat, and tears into building Miller's Auto and Fleet. It started as a tiny 2-bay garage with a leaky roof and a cracked concrete floor where the winter wind cut right to the bone. By the time I was done, it was a highly successful chain of 6 repair shops servicing massive commercial trucks across the entire county. I worked grueling 14-hour days. I missed birthdays. I missed holidays. I sacrificed my own body because I truly believed I was building an unshakable foundation for my family. And at the absolute center of that family was my wife, Susan. We met when we were teenagers at our local community church. Susan was 62 now, but in my tired eyes, she was always that same bright, smiling girl who organized the Sunday school bake sales. I loved that woman with a blind, absolute devotion. I was the guy crawling under heavy machinery, turning the wrenches, and breathing in toxic exhaust fumes, but Susan was the undisputed brains of the operation. I handed over every single paycheck to her without a second thought. She managed the home. She balanced our personal checkbooks. She paid the bills. I trusted her more than I trusted my own heartbeat. In my mind, we were the perfect team. I provided the muscle, and she provided the structure. Our lives revolved heavily around our booming business, our adult daughter Chloe, and our church. Susan was the head of the ladies' auxiliary. She was respected by everyone in the congregation. She was admired. Everyone in our town thought she was the absolute pinnacle of a devoted, loving Christian wife. I thought so too. I never checked our bank statements. I never asked for receipts. When a man loves a woman for 40 years, he does not question her loyalty. He simply works his fingers to the bone to give her the world. But the heavy auto repair business is a young man's game. By my late 60s, the physical toll was getting entirely too hard to ignore. I could not slide under a truck chassis like I used to without feeling sharp stabbing pains in my spine. My doctor sat me down and told me I needed to slow down immediately, or I would end up permanently in a wheelchair. So when a massive national auto service corporation approached me with a highly generous buyout offer, I finally decided to listen. The intense negotiation process took several agonizing months, but on a crisp Friday morning in October, I sat in a sleek downtown law office and signed my life's work away. The corporate executives in their expensive tailored suits shook my calloused hand and pushed a pristine piece of paper across the polished mahogany table. It was the official confirmation of the bank wire transfer. $6 million. $6 million had just been officially deposited into the joint account I shared with Susan. I walked out of that towering glass building feeling lighter than I had in 40 long years. The heavy, crushing burden of running 6 busy garages was completely gone. I drove my battered old pickup truck back to our suburban home with tears of genuine joy blurring my vision. I was secretly planning the ultimate surprise for Susan. I had spent the last few weekends quietly fixing up my old hunting RV, a vintage motorhome I kept parked hidden behind my original garage. I wanted to surprise her with early retirement. I pictured us driving across the country, visiting beautiful national parks, waking up to quiet mountain sunrises, and spending our golden years in total unbothered peace. I wanted us to dedicate our remaining time to serving our local church community without the constant grueling stress of overhead costs and employee payrolls. I honestly thought I had finally given us the freedom we deeply deserved. I thought the lifelong struggle was finally over forever. That Sunday, just 2 days after the $6 million hit our bank account, we hosted our annual autumn family barbecue. The weather was absolutely beautiful. The spacious backyard was filled with the rich, mouth-watering smell of roasting hickory wood and grilled ribs. The lawn was freshly cut. We had about 30 people over. Neighbors, church friends, and extended family were laughing and drinking sweet iced tea on the wide stone patio. Susan was playing the perfect hostess, flawlessly passing out plates of potato salad and smiling that warm, familiar smile. I stood proudly by the hot grill flipping burgers and feeling a deep, profound sense of pride expanding in my chest. I looked around my yard and thought about how incredibly lucky I was. I was just about to clink my glass and announce my official retirement to the entire happy crowd when the front doorbell rang loud and clear. I wiped my greasy hands on my stained apron and walked slowly through the quiet house to answer it. I figured it was just another neighbor dropping by late with a sweet dessert. I pulled the heavy oak door open with a massive, welcoming smile on my face. A young man in a cheap gray suit stood on the porch. He did not smile back. He looked down at a clipboard and asked if I was Thomas Miller. I told him I was. He reached into his battered briefcase, pulled out a thick manila envelope, and pressed it hard against my chest. "You have been served," he said, his voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. He turned around and walked briskly down the driveway, getting into a parked sedan and speeding away without ever looking back. I stood on the quiet porch staring blankly at the heavy envelope in my hands. My heart did a strange, heavy flutter. I tore the thick paper open. The legal jargon jumped out at me like a vicious physical blow. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Plaintiff Susan Miller. Defendant Thomas Miller. I could not breathe. I read the terrifying words over and over again, but my brain utterly refused to process them. My wife of 40 years, the woman who had kissed me that very morning, the woman laughing out in our backyard with our closest friends, was divorcing me. I stumbled blindly back into the house, walking like an empty ghost through the sliding glass doors to the patio. The happy chatter of our guests faded into a dull, sickening ringing in my ears. I held the crumpled papers up my worn hands, shaking violently. Susan was standing near the patio table holding a tray of drinks. She turned and saw the manila envelope firmly in my grip. And in that exact, terrifying second, the woman I had loved for 4 decades completely vanished. Her warm, gentle, church-going demeanor evaporated like water on a hot engine block. The sweet smile fell from her face, instantly replaced by a cold, hard mask of absolute, calculated malice. She did not look shocked. She did not look guilty. She looked exactly like a hungry predator who had finally caught her unsuspecting prey. I asked her what this was. My voice cracked loud enough that the guests around us immediately stopped talking. The soft music playing from the outdoor speakers suddenly felt suffocating. Everyone turned to look at us in stunned, terrible silence. Susan set the tray down with chilling composure. She looked me dead in the eyes, and her voice was like solid ice. "I am taking what I am owed Tom," she said loudly for everyone to hear. I am not spending my golden years watching you tinker with broken-down cars. You sold the business. I am taking my half and I am leaving right now." I stood there entirely paralyzed in front of our closest friends and family. The silence in the backyard was deafening. The pastor of our church was standing just a few feet away, staring at Susan in pure, unadulterated horror. But Susan did not care at all. She crossed her arms and looked at me with a look of such deep, profound contempt that it physically knocked the wind right out of my aging lungs. I realized in that horrifying, agonizing moment that she had waited. She had waited patiently for the exact day the $6 million cleared the bank. She had planned this vicious ambush perfectly to maximize my ultimate humiliation. The panic hit me like a violent, crashing tidal wave. I could not process the overwhelming, brutal betrayal. I could not stand there and be stared at by 30 people while my entire life collapsed into worthless ashes. I dropped the metal spatula I was still holding. It clattered loudly against the stone floor. I turned around and ran. I ran blindly through the house, out the front door, and threw myself into my pickup truck. My hands were shaking so terribly I could barely get the metal key into the ignition. I slammed the truck into reverse tires, screeching loudly against the asphalt, and drove away blindly into the quiet suburban streets. I drove for miles, my chest heaving, as hot tears of absolute shock and betrayal streamed down my wrinkled face. I pulled into a deserted grocery store parking lot, grasping the steering wheel tight and trying to catch my breath. I reached for my pocket to get my phone to call my lawyer to figure out what was happening. My pocket was completely empty. I patted my other pockets frantically. Nothing. I looked at the passenger seat. My heart stopped beating completely. In my blind, desperate panic to escape the crushing humiliation in my backyard, I had fled with absolutely nothing but the clothes on my back. My leather wallet with all my credit cards and identification was sitting on the kitchen counter. My phone was plugged into the wall charger in the master bedroom, and significantly worse, the heavy brass ring of keys that opened the massive steel safe in my home office, the safe that held all my personal documents and the original deeds to the auto shops, was resting right next to my wallet. I was 68 years old. I had just sold my company for $6 million. But sitting in that dark, lonely parking lot, I realized I had absolutely nothing. I was entirely locked out of my own life. I sat in that dark grocery store parking lot for what felt like an eternity. The engine of my old pickup truck clicked and cooled in the quiet night. My breathing was heavy and ragged. I stared at my empty hands resting on the steering wheel, trying to make sense of the nightmare that had just unfolded in my own backyard. The shock was a physical weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to draw a full breath. I was a man who had always fixed things. If an engine knocked, I found the problem, and I repaired it. But how was I supposed to fix a betrayal this deep? Susan had looked at me with such absolute coldness. It was a look I had never seen in our 40 years of marriage. The weather seemed to match the absolute ruin of my life. The clear autumn sky darkened rapidly, and a heavy, freezing rain began to pour down, hitting the windshield of my truck like handfuls of gravel. I realized I could not just sit there in the dark forever. I needed to go back to my house. I needed to face my wife and demand an explanation. I needed my wallet, my phone, and my keys. I put the truck in gear and pulled out of the parking lot, driving slowly through the familiar suburban streets of my Ohio town. The rain washed over the roads, blurring the streetlights. Every house I passed looked warm and inviting, with lights glowing in the windows. I wondered how many of those homes held secrets just like mine. When I finally turned onto my street and pulled up to my driveway, the sight that greeted me made my stomach drop into my shoes. The house was completely dark. The guests were long gone, and the leftover barbecue supplies had been cleared away. But there, sitting in the middle of the driveway, getting absolutely soaked by the freezing rain, were 3 large black garbage bags. I parked my truck and stepped out into the downpour. The cold rain soaked right through my thin shirt instantly, but I barely felt it. I walked up to the garbage bags and pulled one open. Inside were my clothes. My work shirts, my worn jeans, my boots. Everything I owned had been carelessly stuffed into trash bags and thrown out like garbage. My heart hammered against my ribs as I walked up the steps to the front porch. I reached into my pocket out of pure habit, hoping to find my keys, but remembered I had left them on the kitchen counter. I tried the door handle. It was locked. I knocked on the heavy oak door. I knocked harder, shouting Susan's name over the sound of the pouring rain. There was no answer. I walked around to the side of the house and tried the code on the garage keypad. A red light flashed. Denied. She had changed the security code. I went to the back patio where we had been laughing with our friends just hours earlier. I tried the sliding glass door. It was dead-bolted from the inside, and a thick wooden dowel had been wedged into the track. She had locked me out. She had systematically secured the house against me, knowing I would come back. This was not a sudden emotional reaction. This was a carefully executed plan. I stood there shivering in the cold rain, looking at the dark windows of the house I had paid for with 40 years of back-breaking labor. I was entirely shut out of my own life. I walked back to my truck, soaked to the bone and shivering violently. I gathered the wet garbage bags and threw them into the passenger seat. I climbed behind the wheel and turned the heater up as high as it would go, but it did little to chase away the deep, chilling cold that had settled into my soul. I needed a hot cup of coffee to warm my hands and clear my head. I drove to a small 24-hour diner on the edge of town. The bright neon sign flickered against the rainy night sky. I parked and walked inside, dripping water onto the linoleum floor. The waitress gave me a sympathetic look as I sat at the counter. I ordered a black coffee. When she brought the steaming mug, I reached into the glove box of my truck and found a spare debit card I kept hidden for emergencies. It was tied to our primary joint checking account. I handed the card to the cashier, feeling a slight sense of relief. At least I had access to my money. I had $6 million to my name. I could figure this out. The cashier swiped the card through the machine. She frowned and tried it again. "I am sorry, honey," she said softly. "It says declined." I stared at her in total confusion. I told her to try it one more time, explaining there had to be a mistake. We had millions in that account. The bank had confirmed the wire transfer just 2 days ago. She wiped the magnetic strip on her apron and swiped it a third time. The machine beeped loudly. Declined. She looked at me with pity in her eyes. "I am sorry," she repeated. "Do you have another card or some cash?" I patted my empty pockets. I had nothing. No cash, no phone, no other cards. I mumbled a quiet apology, pushed the steaming cup of coffee away, and walked back out into the freezing rain. The humiliation burned my face. I was 68 years old, a multi-millionaire on paper, and I could not even buy a $2 cup of coffee. Susan had not just locked me out of our home. She had completely frozen my access to our joint accounts. She had stripped me of every single resource I had in the world. Desperation began to claw at my throat. Where was I supposed to go? I had no money for a hotel. I could not call a friend because I did not have my phone, and I was too proud and ashamed to show up at someone's doorstep in the middle of the night, soaking wet and crying like a broken child. I drove through the dark, empty streets until I found myself pulling into the back lot of my original auto repair shop. I still owned the small piece of land behind the main building. Parked in the tall, overgrown grass was my old hunting RV. It was a battered, rusted motorhome from the 1980s that I had used for weekend fishing trips decades ago. I had been meaning to fix it up for my surprise retirement trip with Susan, but I had not gotten around to repairing the generator or the heating system. I parked my truck and grabbed one of the garbage bags. I forced the rusty door of the RV open. and stepped inside. The air inside was stale and smelled like mildew and old dust. It was freezing cold. There was no electricity, no running water, and absolutely no heat. I stumbled through the dark, tripping over tools and old camping gear, until I found the small bed in the back. I stripped off my soaking wet clothes and pulled a dry flannel shirt and some jeans from the garbage bag. I curled up on the bare, thin mattress, pulling an old, dusty sleeping bag over my shivering body. The physical pain of the freezing cold seeped directly into my aching bones. My bad back throbbed relentlessly, making it impossible to find a comfortable position. But the physical suffering was absolutely nothing compared to the agonizing psychological betrayal tearing my mind apart. I lay there in the pitch-black darkness, listening to the rain beat against the thin metal roof of the RV, and I cried. I cried harder than I had cried my entire life. I thought about Susan. I thought about the woman who had packed my lunches every morning for 40 years. The woman who had held my hand in church every Sunday. The woman I had trusted with my entire life. How could she do this? How could she smile at me, serve drinks to our friends, and then hand me divorce papers, completely destroying my world in a matter of seconds? I tried to find a reason. I searched my memories for signs of her unhappiness. Had I worked too much? Had I neglected her? But even if I had not been the perfect husband, no one deserved to be thrown out onto the street like discarded trash. The contrast between my reality and my expectations was maddening. Just 2 days ago, I was celebrating the sale of my business. I was a wealthy man ready to enjoy my golden years. Now I was a homeless beggar, shivering in a rusted metal box with nothing but garbage bags to my name. The sheer cruelty of her planning tortured me. She had waited for the $6 million to clear. She had secured the money and then discarded me the moment I was no longer useful to her. She had manipulated me flawlessly. The night stretched on in a seemingly endless cycle of freezing cold and heartbroken tears. I did not sleep for a single minute. I just lay there shaking, waiting for the sun to rise. I knew I could not just give up. I had worked too hard my entire life to let my wife steal everything I had built. I needed to understand exactly what she had done and how she had done it. When the first gray light of dawn finally crept through the dirty windows of the RV, I forced myself to get up. My body was incredibly stiff, and my joints screamed in protest with every single movement. I put on my boots and walked out into the chilly morning air. The rain had stopped, leaving the world wet and gray. I got into my truck and drove straight to the main branch of my bank downtown. I sat in the parking lot for an hour waiting for the doors to open. At exactly 9 o'clock, I walked into the warm lobby. The branch manager, a kind woman named Martha, recognized me immediately. I had been doing business with this bank for 30 years. She smiled warmly and asked how I was enjoying my new retirement. I tried to keep my voice steady as I asked to speak with her in private. She led me into her glass-walled office and offered me a seat. I sat down and looked her straight in the eyes, explaining that I had lost my wallet and needed to withdraw some cash from my joint account with my wife Susan. Martha pulled up my account on her computer screen. Her friendly smile slowly faded, replaced by a look of deep confusion and concern. She typed a few more keys and looked at me with a pained expression. "Tom," she said softly, her voice full of hesitation. "Your joint checking account has been completely drained. There are only a few $100s left to cover the automatic bill payments." I felt the blood drain from my face. I asked her what she was talking about. I told her the $6 million wire transfer from the sale of my business had cleared on Friday morning. The money had to be there. Martha turned her computer screen slightly so I could see the numbers. "The $6 million did clear on Friday morning," she explained gently. "But on Thursday afternoon, the day before the massive wire transfer came through, Susan came into the bank. She withdrew $400,000 in cash and secured a certified cashier's check for another significant amount. Then, on Friday afternoon, just hours after the $6 million was deposited, she transferred the entire remaining balance into a newly created private account, solely in her name. I am so sorry, Tom, but because her name was on the joint account, she had the full legal right to move the funds. You currently have no access to that new account. I sat in the comfortable leather chair, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the deception. Susan had not just taken the $6 million. She had started draining our existing life savings the day before the sale was even finalized. She had walked into this very bank, smiled at the tellers, and systematically stripped me of every single penny I had earned over a lifetime of hard labor. This was not just a bitter wife asking for a divorce. This was a highly calculated, flawlessly executed financial heist. She had planned this down to the exact minute. She knew the exact timeline of the business sale, and she struck with absolute ruthless precision. The profound heartbreak that had crippled me in the freezing RV all night slowly began to harden into something else entirely. The crushing sorrow evaporated, leaving behind a cold, sharp, and focused anger. I looked at Martha and thanked her for her help. I stood up and walked out of the bank, feeling a new kind of energy pumping through my exhausted veins. The conflict in my mind immediately pivoted. I was no longer asking why my wife was divorcing me. I knew why. She wanted the money. But the withdrawal of $400,000 in pure cash the day before the sale raised a massive, terrifying question. Where exactly was my money going? What did Susan need with almost $500,000 in untraceable cash before she even got her hands on the business payout? She was hiding something huge, and I was going to find out exactly what it was. I climbed back into my pickup truck, no longer a broken old man crying in the dark. I was a mechanic, and my life had just been dismantled. It was time for me to find the missing pieces and put the truth back together. I sat in the cab of my truck, watching the rain slide down the windshield. The bank manager's words were still ringing in my ears like a loud alarm bell. $400,000 withdrawn in cash and cashier's checks the day before the sale of the business. My entire life savings drained while I was shaking hands and signing contracts, thinking I was securing our golden years. A lesser man might have driven to the nearest bridge and let the cold water take him. A lesser man might have driven back to that big, beautiful house and broken the door down with a crowbar just to scream at the woman who stole his life. But I did not do either of those things. I am a mechanic. When a transmission blows, you do not sit on the side of the highway and cry about the broken gears. You roll up your sleeves, you get underneath the machine, and you figure out exactly what snapped. My grief was entirely gone. The crushing sorrow that had kept me shivering in that rusted RV all night had been burned away by a hot, focused anger. Susan thought I was just a dumb grease monkey. She thought because I handed over my paycheck every week without looking at the ledger that I was incapable of understanding a ledger at all. She underestimated me. I reached into the glove box and pulled out a small black address book I kept for emergencies. I flipped through the worn pages until I found the name I was looking for. Henry Lawson. Henry and I went way back. Before he retired, he was one of the sharpest forensic accountants in the state. We met 20 years ago when my business was expanding and I needed someone to audit my books to make sure my managers were playing it straight. Henry was a man who could look at a mountain of numbers and instantly spot the one single penny that was out of place. He owed me a favor. 10 years ago, his son got into a bad car accident. The kid was fine, but the car was destroyed, and Henry did not have the cash for a new one at the time. I completely rebuilt the engine and straightened the frame for free. I told him to consider it a down payment on a rainy day. Well, it was pouring outside, and I was cashing in that favor. I borrowed a quarter from the ashtray, walked over to a soaked payphone outside a convenience store, and dialed his number. He answered on the third ring. His voice was gravelly and tired, but he sharpened up immediately when I told him it was Tom and that I was in serious trouble. I did not give him the whole story over the phone. I just told him I needed his eyes on a massive financial bleed and I needed absolute total secrecy. Henry did not ask a single question. He just gave me an address for a diner on the outskirts of town and told me to meet him there in an hour. The diner was a fading relic from the 1970s. It smelled like old fryer grease, strong bleach, and burnt coffee. It was exactly the kind of place where nobody looked twice at two older men sitting in a back booth for hours. I slid into the cracked red vinyl seat and waited. 10 minutes later, Henry walked through the double doors. He was a tall, thin man with sharp gray eyes and a silver beard. He carried a battered leather briefcase that looked older than he did. He slid into the booth across from me, placed the briefcase on the table, and signaled the waitress for 2 black coffees. He looked at my face, taking in my exhausted eyes, my wet clothes, and the deep lines of stress etched into my forehead. "You look like you just went 10 rounds with a freight train, Tom," he said softly. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the sticky table. "I feel like it too, Henry. I need your help. My wife just filed for divorce, locked me out of the house, and drained $400,000 from our joint accounts the day before I sold the business." Henry did not gasp. He did not show any dramatic shock. He just slowly opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick silver laptop. He flipped the screen open and adjusted his glasses. "That is a highly coordinated strike," he said, his fingers already moving over the keyboard. "You do not move $500,000 quietly without a solid destination already set up. A sudden massive withdrawal triggers bank flags and IRS reports. If she pulled that much in cash and cashier's checks, she had a perfectly clean place to park it." I handed him the scrap of paper where the bank manager had scribbled the transaction codes and the withdrawal times. "I need to know where my money went, Henry. I need to know what she is planning to do with it." For the next 3 hours, the diner faded away around us. The waitress kept our mugs full, but neither of us touched the food we ordered. Henry's fingers flew across his keyboard, accessing public records, property deeds, state registries, and financial databases I had never even heard of. I sat there watching the reflection of the screen in his glasses, feeling the tension coil tighter and tighter in my chest. I kept running through the possibilities in my mind. Was there another man? Was she buying a secret house in another state to escape with a lover? Was she funneling it to an offshore account in the Caribbean? I pictured her laughing with some slick, smooth-talking guy spending the money I bled for on expensive dinners and luxury cars. The betrayal was a physical ache, a sharp knife twisting right between my ribs. I had trusted her blindly. I had worshipped the ground she walked on. Every single drop of sweat that fell from my brow in the middle of those sweltering summer days in the garage was for her comfort. Finally, Henry stopped typing. He took a long, slow sip of his cold coffee and stared at the screen. His brow was deeply furrowed. "Well, I will give her this," he said, his voice laced with a grim kind of respect. "Your wife is not a typical amateur. This is incredibly sophisticated, Tom. She did not wire the money to the Cayman Islands. She did not buy a luxury condo in Florida. She hid it right out in the open." I leaned forward, my heart hammering against my chest. "What do you mean, right out in the open? Where is my money?" Henry turned the laptop around so I could see the screen. It was a page from the State Business Registry. It displayed a newly formed non-profit organization. The name on the top of the registration was Grace and Light Community Outreach. I stared at the name, completely baffled. Grace and Light. "What is this?" I asked. "It is a registered religious charity," Henry explained, pointing at the tax-exempt status codes on the screen. According to these filings, it was established exactly 3 months ago, the exact same time you started the final negotiations to sell your business. Susan took your $400,000 and donated it directly to this charity. Because it is structured as a religious outreach program, the donation is completely tax-shielded. And because the money was moved before the divorce papers were filed and the asset freeze was put in place, it looks like a legitimate charitable contribution from a devoted church-going family. The sheer devious brilliance of it hit me like a physical blow. Susan was the head of the ladies' auxiliary at our church. She organized the food drives. She led the Sunday school fundraisers. Everyone in our town looked at her as a pillar of absolute moral integrity. She was using that exact reputation to launder my money. If I went to the judge right now and accused her of stealing $400,000, she would simply play the victim. She would look the judge in the eye and say she was making a blessed donation to help the poor and needy. She would claim I was a greedy, bitter old man trying to steal money from the church. She was using our faith, our community, and our friends as a bulletproof shield for her financial crimes. My hands curled into tight fists under the table. The anger I felt was no longer just about the money. It was about the absolute desecration of everything we stood for. She was twisting the very community we belonged to into a weapon against me. "How do we prove it is a scam?" I asked, my voice trembling with suppressed rage. "How do we prove she controls this money?" Henry adjusted his glasses and pulled the laptop back toward him. "That is the tricky part," he said, his eyes scanning the detailed corporate bylaws. "If she registered herself as the sole director of the charity, it would be an obvious conflict of interest in a divorce hearing. The judge would see right through it. She is far too smart for that. She needs a proxy. She needs someone to hold the keys to this charity, someone she controls completely, but someone whose name distances her from the money on paper." I watched him type furiously, running cross-checks on the registration documents, the corporate officers, and the board of directors. The diner was completely quiet, except for the low hum of the refrigerator behind the counter and the rapid clicking of Henry's keyboard. I felt sick to my stomach. Who could she possibly trust, with nearly $500,000 in stolen cash? Who in our church would agree to be a part of something so deeply malicious? I thought about the people at the barbecue just yesterday. The smiling faces, the warm handshakes, the people who drank my beer and ate my food while my wife was preparing to throw me out onto the street. Were they in on it? Did the pastor know? Did the other ladies in the auxiliary know? I felt a terrifying wave of paranoia wash over me. I suddenly felt like I was surrounded by enemies, like my entire 40-year life in this town was an elaborate stage play, and everyone had the script except me. "I got a hit," Henry said, suddenly breaking my spiraling thoughts. His voice was sharp, his eyes locked on the screen. "Did you find the director?" I asked, leaning across the table. "Yes," Henry replied. "I pulled the original articles of incorporation. The charity is set up as a closed board, meaning the registered agent has total absolute control over the financial distributions. They can authorize salaries grants and property purchases without any outside oversight. It is the perfect vehicle to hold massive amounts of cash and bleed it out slowly as administrative expenses." "Who is it?" I demanded, my voice rising slightly. "Who is the registered agent holding my money?" Henry slowly turned the laptop screen back toward me. He tapped the bottom of the legal document, where a bold digital signature rested on the dotted line. I looked at the name. I stared at the bold black letters on the glowing white screen. The breath left my lungs in a sudden violent rush. The entire diner seemed to tilt sideways. The roaring in my ears returned louder and more vicious than before. The registered agent for Grace and Light Community Outreach was not the pastor. It was not a church elder. It was not one of Susan's friends from the auxiliary board. The name on the document was Richard Vance. My blood ran completely cold. Richard, Susan's younger brother, the slick, fast-talking real estate agent who had always looked at me with thinly veiled disgust. Richard, who wore custom-tailored suits and drove imported sports cars. Richard, who never missed an opportunity to mock the grease under my fingernails and the dirt on my boots. For 40 years, I had endured his condescending remarks for the sake of family harmony. I had loaned him money when his early real estate ventures failed. I had fixed his luxury cars for free. I had welcomed him into my home every Thanksgiving and Christmas. And all this time, he was plotting with my wife to destroy me. Susan did not just plan this betrayal alone. She had brought her family into it. They had conspired together, sitting around my dining room table, smiling in my face, while they slowly, meticulously built the trapdoor right under my feet. Richard was the proxy. Richard was the one holding the keys to the kingdom. I stared at the name on the screen, and a cold, terrifying clarity settled over my mind. They thought I was beaten. They thought I was a broken old mechanic who would just crawl into a hole and accept defeat. They thought, because I did not understand corporate law, that I would not fight back. But they forgot one very important thing. I spent 40 years taking apart broken machines, diagnosing the hidden faults, and putting them back together stronger than they were before. They had built a very clever machine to steal my life. I looked up at Henry. My hands were no longer shaking. "Find out where Richard is right now." I said, my voice harder and colder than it had ever been. "We are going to tear their machine apart piece by piece." Henry wrote the address on a clean paper napkin and slid it across the sticky diner table. It was a commercial building located right in the middle of the wealthiest financial district in the city. I looked at the address and folded the napkin, sliding it into my damp shirt pocket. I thanked Henry for his help. He told me to be careful and promised to keep digging into the charity records to see what else he could find. I walked out of the diner, and the cool autumn air hit my face. The rain had finally stopped, but the sky was still a bruised, angry purple. I climbed into my old, battered pickup truck and started the engine. My thick, calloused hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned completely white. I thought about Richard as I drove toward the city skyline. Richard was my arrogant, slick-talking brother-in-law. He was a man who wore $3,000 tailored suits, while I wore oil-stained coveralls. He was a man who always made subtle, condescending jokes about my lack of a college degree at every single Thanksgiving dinner we ever hosted. I had paid for his reckless mistakes time and time again over the past 40 years. When his very first real estate business went bankrupt decades ago, I handed him $10,000 in cash to keep his house out of foreclosure. He never paid me back. I never asked him to pay me back. I believed that family took care of family. I believed we were bound by loyalty and faith. Or so I thought. I navigated the heavy city traffic until I reached the towering glass and steel building where Richard ran his luxury real estate firm. I pulled my rusted pickup truck into the immaculate underground parking garage, parking it right between two imported luxury sports cars. I stepped out of the truck, ignoring the strange looks from the men in business suits walking past me. I walked straight to the elevator bank and pressed the button for the top floor. My heart was pounding with a slow, rhythmic fury. I was not a violent man. I had never raised my hand to another person in my entire life. But the sheer magnitude of this financial deception made my blood boil in my veins. The elevator doors slid open, revealing a pristine reception area with shining marble floors and expensive modern art on the walls. A young receptionist behind a massive curved desk looked up at me with immediate disapproval. I did not belong in this world of polished glass and soft leather. She opened her mouth to ask if I had an appointment, but I walked right past her without saying a single word. I knew exactly which office belonged to Richard. I marched down the wide carpeted hallway and pushed open the heavy frosted glass door to his private executive suite. Richard was sitting behind a massive mahogany desk reviewing a stack of glossy architectural plans. He wore a crisp blue dress shirt and a silk tie. When the door slammed against the wall, he looked up. He did not look shocked. He did not jump or call for security. He simply set his expensive gold pen down on the desk and smiled. It was a smug, perfectly practiced real estate smile. It was the smile of a man who knew he held all the winning cards. "I guess the old mechanic finally figured out how to read a financial statement," Richard said, leaning back in his plush leather chair. His voice was smooth and utterly devoid of any guilt. I walked right up to the edge of his desk. I planted my heavy work boots on his expensive rug and looked down at him. I asked him about the fake charity. I demanded to know why my life savings were sitting in a shell corporation registered in his name. I wanted him to deny it. I wanted him to tell me it was a massive misunderstanding. But Richard just laughed. It was a cold, hollow sound that echoed off the glass walls of his office. He did not deny a single thing. He looked completely proud of himself. He treated my ruined life like a highly successful corporate merger. Richard told me I was always too blind to see the truth right in front of my face. He told me that Susan had stopped loving me 15 long years ago. He said she absolutely hated the smell of dirty motor oil on my skin. She hated the dark grease I tracked into her pristine laundry room. She hated the fact that her husband was a blue-collar laborer while her friends were married to doctors and lawyers. But she loved the money, Richard said, his eyes gleaming with malicious delight. She knew your auto repair business was growing exponentially. She knew the massive national corporate buyers were sniffing around town looking for local chains to buy out. We sat in your beautiful living room drinking your expensive scotch while you were at the shop working 14-hour shifts. We watched you pop pain pills for your broken back. We knew your spine would eventually give out completely. We knew you would have to sell the business. We just had to be patient and wait for the final payday. I listened to this toxic poison spilling out of his mouth, and I felt completely sick to my stomach. My own wife and my brother-in-law had spent a decade plotting my absolute destruction. They had watched me destroy my physical health to provide for them, knowing the entire time they were going to steal the final reward. The sheer calculated cruelty of the revelation was almost too much to bear. I leaned over the desk, my voice dropping to a dangerous, furious whisper. I told him he might have stolen the $400,000 in cash, but I still had the rest of the $6 million from the corporate buyout. I told him I was going to hire the most ruthless corporate lawyers in the entire state of Ohio. I promised him I would freeze his fake charity, report him to the federal tax authorities, and bury him and Susan in so much litigation they would spend the rest of their miserable lives in a federal prison cell. Richard did not flinch. He did not look scared. He just smiled wider. He opened his top desk drawer and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of legal documents securely bound in a blue folder. He slid the folder across the smooth mahogany desk until it rested right in front of my hands. "You always were a simple man, Tom," Richard said softly. "You really think Susan and I would take the loose cash and just leave you with the golden goose? Open the folder, Tom. Read the paperwork." I reached out with a trembling hand and flipped open the blue cover. The legal jargon jumped out at me, printed on official county courthouse letterhead. It was a formal legal lien. It was an immediate asset freeze order filed against my commercial business sale. I stared at the paperwork, completely confused. I asked him what this garbage was. I told him he had absolutely no legal right to touch my business payout. Richard steepled his fingers together and looked at me with pure triumph. "It is a family loan agreement, Tom, from 12 years ago. You see, 12 years ago, when you were desperately trying to expand your operations and build your third auto shop, you needed capital. According to these legally binding documents, I personally loaned you and Susan $500,000 from my own private real estate funds to finance your commercial expansion. The contract clearly states that upon the sale or liquidation of your business, I am entitled to the full repayment of my principal loan plus 12 years of accumulated compounding interest and a 20% equity stake in the final sale price. I stared at him in absolute horror. I told him he was a pathological liar. I never took a single dime from him. I financed that third shop using a standard commercial bank loan that I paid off completely 5 years ago with my own sweat and blood. I never signed a contract with him. Richard simply tapped his manicured finger against the bottom of the top page. I looked down at the dotted line. My signature was right there in black ink. It looked exactly like my handwriting. The loops, the slant, the pressure. It was a perfect, flawless match. But I never signed that document. Susan forged it! I whispered, the horrific realization washing over me like a bucket of ice water. She had access to every single document in our home. She handled all the banking. She knew exactly how to replicate my signature perfectly. She forged my name to create a massive fake debt. Exactly. Richard said, his voice practically purring with satisfaction. Susan provided the internal documentation. I provided the legal structure. My lawyers filed the official lien at the county courthouse at exactly 8 o'clock this morning. Your remaining $6 million is now completely frozen in a complex web of commercial litigation. You cannot touch a single penny of your own buyout until this fake debt is settled in court. And by the time the lawyers are done fighting over the authenticity of that signature, the legal fees will bleed you entirely dry. The trap was absolutely perfect. The sheer evil of their coordinated strike left me literally gasping for air. They had covered every single possible angle. They stole the liquid cash through the fake church charity. They tied up the massive wire transfer with a forged commercial lien. They completely severed my access to our joint checking accounts. They left me to rot in a freezing, rusted RV with absolutely nothing but the clothes on my back. They had stolen my past, my present, and my entire future in one single devastating weekend. I looked at Richard sitting there so comfortable and proud in his luxury office. I told him he would burn in hell for this. I told him that God sees everything and this kind of evil does not go unpunished. Richard just adjusted his silk tie and let out a short, amused breath. He told me to get out of his office before he called the building security team to have me forcefully removed for trespassing. I turned around and walked out of the glass door. My chest was so incredibly tight I felt like I was having a massive heart attack. I stumbled blindly down the carpeted hallway and rode the elevator down to the parking garage. The air in the concrete structure was damp and smelled strongly of exhaust fumes. My mind was spinning frantically, trying to figure out how a man with no money and no home survives a legal freeze on all his massive assets. How was I supposed to hire a lawyer to fight a forged document when I could not even afford a cup of coffee at a cheap diner? I walked slowly across the dim concrete levels of the parking garage, heading toward the dark corner where I had parked my battered truck. The sound of a revving engine echoed loudly against the concrete walls. I heard the sharp screech of tires on the pavement. A pristine white luxury sedan pulled smoothly into the VIP parking area specifically reserved for the real estate executives. I recognized the car immediately. My heart skipped a heavy, painful beat. It was the exact car I had purchased brand new for my daughter Chloe just 3 years ago when she got her new job. I stopped walking. I stepped behind a thick concrete support pillar, hiding myself in the deep shadows. The driver's side door of the white sedan opened. Chloe stepped out. My beautiful 28-year-old daughter, the little girl I had taught to ride a bicycle in our driveway, the young woman I had proudly walked down the church aisle on her wedding day, The child I had worked 14-hour shifts for, just to make sure she could go to a good college without a single penny of student debt. She was clutching a thick brown manila envelope tightly against her chest. She looked around the dim parking garage, nervously checking over her shoulder twice to make sure nobody was watching her. She looked terrified and exhausted. Then she turned and walked briskly straight toward the private secure elevator that led directly up to Richard's office suite. My heart shattered into a million jagged, irreparable pieces. The emotional pain that hit me in that exact moment was significantly worse than any physical injury I had ever endured in my entire 40 years of hard labor. Susan and Richard were greedy, malicious monsters, but they were adults making calculated, selfish choices. Chloe was my own flesh and blood. Chloe was my heart walking outside my body. Seeing her sneaking quietly into the enemy's camp, carrying hidden documents to the very man who had just systematically destroyed my entire life, completely broke me. I stood there, in the dark shadows, leaning heavily against the cold concrete pillar, unable to breathe or speak. The entire world around me slowly faded to black. I realized in that crushing, agonizing second that I was entirely alone in the universe. The people I loved most in this world, the family I had sacrificed my entire body to protect, were actively conspiring together to bury me alive. I sat in the freezing cab of my rusted pickup truck for a long time after watching Chloe disappear into that private, secure elevator. The heavy, damp concrete walls of the underground parking garage felt exactly like a cold, dark tomb closing in around me. I could not move a single muscle. I could not formulate a single rational thought. The terrifying image of my beautiful 28-year-old daughter clutching that brown manila envelope sneaking up to Richard's executive office burned into my exhausted brain like a hot branding iron. I gripped the worn leather of the steering wheel until my hands ached fiercely. I thought about the beautiful, warm afternoon she was born. I thought about holding her tiny, fragile hand in the bright hospital room, promising God and everything holy that I would protect her from every single evil in this world. I worked grueling 14-hour shifts in the shop, breathing in toxic diesel exhaust fumes and breaking my spine under heavy commercial trucks, just so she could have a perfect, flawless life. I paid for her college tuition in full in cash, so she would never know the crushing, suffocating weight of a student loan. I paid for her beautiful wedding. I loved her with every single ounce of my soul. And now my own mind was forcing me to believe that she was actively conspiring with the very people who had maliciously thrown me out onto the street like discarded garbage. The sharp physical pain of my ruined spine was absolutely nothing compared to the violent, agonizing twisting in my heart. But I knew I could not just let it go. I could not just hide in my unheated, rusted RV parked in the tall grass and pretend I had not seen my own flesh and blood betray me. I had to face her. I had to look my daughter directly in the eyes and demand to know why she was helping them tear my life apart. I knew her daily routine perfectly. Every Tuesday morning after she dropped my 2 young grandchildren off at their local preschool, Chloe drove to a small, quiet diner on the edge of the county line. She liked to drink hot green tea and answer her work emails in peace before heading into her office. I waited in absolute agony until Tuesday morning. I drove my battered pickup truck to the diner parking lot and sat there watching the front glass doors. The sky was an overcast, dreary gray, mirroring the absolute desolation I felt inside. When I saw her familiar white sedan pull into a parking space, my stomach churned with a sickening mixture of rage and profound sorrow. I watched her walk inside, clutching her laptop bag. I waited 5 minutes before I stepped out of my truck. I walked into the diner, and the small brass bell above the door jingled loudly. The place was mostly empty. It was a modest fading establishment with cracked yellow vinyl booths and a heavy smell of burnt toast and strong bleach that hung thick in the air. Chloe was sitting alone in a corner booth facing the large front window. She was typing rapidly on her laptop, a steaming porcelain cup of untouched green tea sitting right next to her. As I walked closer, I noticed how terrible she looked. She looked absolutely exhausted. There were deep, dark purple circles under her eyes, and her shoulders were slumped forward like she was physically carrying an unbearable, crushing weight. Her hands trembled slightly as she typed. I did not care. The righteous, burning anger in my chest pushed me forward step by heavy step. I walked across the sticky linoleum floor and slid directly into the booth across from her. She looked up and gasped sharply. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and terrified. "Dad," she whispered, her voice shaking violently. "What are you doing here?" I stared at her. I did not blink. I did not offer a warm, fatherly smile. I just looked at the daughter I had raised and tried to find the girl I knew hiding somewhere behind those frightened eyes. "How much, Chloe?" I asked, my voice low and dangerously cold. I kept my tone perfectly level, but the furious heartbreak bled through every single syllable. "How much did your mother and your Uncle Richard pay you to sell out your own father? Did you get a cut of the $6 million they stole from me? Did they promise to buy you a new house? What is the exact price of a father's unconditional love these days?" I fully expected her to get defensive. I expected her to cross her arms, lift her chin, and spit out angry, fabricated excuses just like her mother had done on the back patio during the barbecue. I braced my exhausted mind for the cruel, harsh words of a greedy, ungrateful child who had willingly chosen a life of stolen luxury over basic family loyalty. I thought she was going to tell me I deserved it. But that is not what happened at all. Chloe did not yell. She did not defend herself. She did not offer a single excuse. Instead, her entire posture collapsed. She slapped her hands over her face and burst into the most agonizing, breathless tears I have ever heard in my entire life. It was not the fake, manipulative crying of a guilty person caught in a lie. It was the raw, terrifying sobbing of a broken, trapped animal. She was gasping for air, her chest heaving violently as she tried to muffle the loud sound of her own deep despair. She looked frantically around the empty diner, her tear-filled eyes darting toward the front door, the counter, and the windows with absolute, pure paranoia. She was genuinely terrified that someone was watching us. "Please, Dad," she begged, reaching across the small table and grabbing my calloused hands tightly. Her delicate fingers were freezing cold and trembling uncontrollably against my rough skin. "Please keep your voice down. If they find out I am talking to you, they will ruin everything. They will take my baby's dad. They will completely destroy us." The thick, heavy wall of furious anger I had built up around my heart instantly shattered into a million pieces. The cold, bitter mechanic who walked into this diner ready to completely disown his traitorous daughter vanished into thin air. In his place, the protective father rushed back to the surface. I looked at her terrified, tear-stained face and the panicked grip she had on my hands, and I realized I had made a massive, terrible mistake. Chloe was not a malicious conspirator. Chloe was a hostage. She was a helpless victim caught struggling in the exact same vicious trap that Susan and Richard had built for me. I squeezed her cold, trembling hands tightly. I leaned across the table, blocking her from the view of the windows. I told her to look at me. I told her that nobody was going to take my grandchildren, and that she needed to tell me exactly what was going on right this very second. Chloe took a deep, ragged breath, pulling a paper napkin from the dispenser and wiping the hot tears from her pale cheeks. She checked the diner entrance one more time before lowering her voice to an absolute, terrified whisper. "It is about Mark," she said, referring to my son-in-law. Mark was a good man, a hard-working, dedicated pediatrician who had just opened his own private medical practice a few years ago. I had always liked Mark. He treated my daughter with immense respect, and he was a wonderful, devoted father to my grandchildren. But starting a new private medical clinic is incredibly expensive and highly stressful. Chloe explained with a breaking voice that about a year ago, Mark had made a terrible, desperate mistake. He was drowning in massive overhead costs and crippling medical school debt. In a moment of absolute blind panic, he had improperly billed a large medical insurance company to cover a sudden shortfall in his clinic payroll. It was a massive federal compliance violation. It was the kind of financial mistake that could not only strip a young doctor of his medical license permanently, but could also easily send him to a federal prison for a very long time. Chloe had quickly discovered the severe billing error, and they had been working desperately day and night to fix the paperwork and quietly repay the money before any official audits caught the massive discrepancy. They were utterly terrified, but they thought they could handle it on their own. Then, a month ago, Mark made the fatal error of confiding in the wrong person. He was having a severe panic attack at a large family dinner, and he quietly pulled Richard aside. He asked Richard for a short-term personal loan to cover the final repayment to the insurance board. Mark thought Richard was a highly successful, wealthy businessman who would understand intense financial pressure. He trusted his uncle-in-law to help family. Richard did not give Mark the loan. Instead, Richard immediately went straight to Susan. They took that highly sensitive illegal information and they weaponized it. They turned a desperate young doctor's isolated mistake into a deadly blade. Chloe looked at me with fresh, hot tears streaming down her face, her voice cracking with profound sorrow. "Mom came to my house the day before the barbecue," she whispered. "She sat in my living room looking at my children playing on the rug. She told me she was divorcing you and taking every single penny of the business sale." I was furious, Dad. I screamed at her. I told her I would testify against her in family court. I told her I would tell the judge exactly what kind of manipulative, cruel person she really was. That is when Susan dropped the hammer. Chloe explained that her own mother looked her completely dead in the eye and smiled a cold, chilling smile. Susan told Chloe that if she said a single word in my defense, if she tried to help me or warn me about the financial drain in any way, Susan and Richard would instantly anonymously report Mark's billing fraud to the Federal Medical Board. They had made copies of the financial ledgers Mark foolishly showed Richard. They had absolute, undeniable proof. They promised to have Mark arrested and thrown into a federal penitentiary by the end of the week. And the brutal threat did not stop there. Susan told Chloe that with Mark rotting in prison and Chloe facing accessory charges, Susan would use her massive stolen $6 million fortune to hire the most ruthless family custody lawyers in the state. She promised she would easily win full permanent legal custody of my grandchildren, claiming Chloe was an unfit criminal mother. Susan explicitly threatened to take Chloe's babies away forever if Chloe did not follow her exact instructions. "They told me I had to be their informant, Dad." Chloe cried, her tears falling onto the diner table. "They told me I had to pretend to be on their side. That manila envelope you saw me carrying into Richard's garage was a stack of blank legal waivers they forced Mark to sign. They own us, Dad. They own our entire lives." I sat in the diner booth completely paralyzed by the sheer unadulterated evil of what my wife had done. It was one thing to steal my money. It was one thing to throw a 68-year-old man out onto the wet street with absolutely nothing but a trash bag of old clothes. But to look at your own daughter, your own innocent grandchildren, and threaten to completely destroy their lives just to protect a stolen fortune. That was a level of pure, calculated malice I simply could not comprehend. Susan was not just a greedy, cheating wife. She was a monster who was willing to destroy her own flesh and blood to get what she wanted. I looked at my daughter shivering and broken across the table. The deep sorrow in my chest hardened into absolute unbreakable resolve. I reached across the table and wiped a tear from her cheek. I told her she did not have to be afraid anymore. I told her that Susan and Richard had made a fatal miscalculation. They thought they were holding all the cards, but they did not realize they had just given me the exact motivation I needed to burn their entire operation to the ground. I sat there in the faded diner booth staring at my beautiful daughter. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting long, tired shadows across Chloe's tear-stained face. I reached across the sticky table and took both of her hands in mine. They were trembling like autumn leaves caught in a bitter wind. I told her to take a deep breath. I told her that no matter what her mother and her Uncle Richard had planned, we were going to figure a way out of this nightmare. I promised her that nobody was going to take my grandchildren away. I watched Chloe swallow hard, taking a shaky sip of her cold green tea. She looked down at her heavy laptop bag resting on the vinyl seat next to her. She unzipped the front pocket slowly and pulled out a small black object. She placed it gently on the table between our coffee mugs. It was a tiny digital audio recorder, no bigger than a pack of chewing gum. I looked at the small black plastic device and then up at my daughter. I asked her what this was all about. Chloe wiped her eyes and took another ragged breath. She told me that her mother was completely obsessed with making sure I did not get a single penny in the divorce settlement. Susan knew that family court judges sometimes took pity on older men who had worked their whole lives only to be thrown out on the street. Susan needed a solid, bulletproof reason for the judge to grant her a total asset freeze and award her every last dime of the $6 million. She needed me to look dangerous. She needed me to sound violent, unhinged, and completely out of control. Chloe looked me right in the eyes and confessed the darkest part of Susan's plan. Susan forced Chloe to go to an electronics store 2 towns over and purchase highly sensitive hidden microphones. Susan ordered my own daughter to visit me at my rusted hunting RV and at my old auto shop office. The mission was simple and absolutely cruel. Chloe was supposed to hide these tiny recording devices in the RV and then deliberately start an argument with me. She was supposed to push my buttons, bring up the divorce, and try to make me yell, make me threaten Susan, or say something completely reckless out of pure anger. Susan wanted hours of recorded audio of me sounding like a bitter, raging old man. She wanted to play those tapes in front of the judge to prove I was a physical threat and a financial liability. I felt a cold, sickening knot form in the very bottom of my stomach. My own wife, the woman I had worshipped for 4 decades, had tried to weaponize my own child against me. She had used the terrifying threat of destroying my son-in-law's medical career and taking away my grandchildren just to force Chloe to wear a wire and trap me. The sheer calculated malice was breathtaking. It was an entirely different level of evil. I looked at the small black recorder sitting on the diner table. I asked Chloe if she had planted it. I asked her if she had recorded our conversations over the past few days. Chloe shook her head vehemently, fresh hot tears spilling down her pale cheeks. She told me she could never do that to me. She said she drove to the RV park 3 nights ago, clutching the microphone in her coat pocket. She stood outside in the freezing rain, looking at the dim light glowing from the tiny window of my camper. She told me she stood out there shivering and remembered everything I had ever done for her. She remembered how I worked 14-hour shifts at the garage so I could buy her a beautiful white dress for her high school prom. She remembered how I paid her college tuition in cash every single semester so she could start her adult life totally debt-free. She remembered how I held her hand and walked her down the aisle looking at her like she was the most precious thing in the entire universe. She looked at me and said she would rather lose absolutely everything than help them destroy the only man who ever truly loved her without conditions. So she made a choice. She made a terrifying, incredibly brave choice. She did not plant the recording devices in my RV. Instead, she drove straight back to the large suburban house I had built for our family. Susan was out at a church committee meeting, playing the role of the perfect devout Christian victim. Chloe still had her keys to the house. She walked right inside and went straight into Susan's private sitting room. She planted the main hidden microphone directly underneath the heavy wooden coffee table where Susan and Richard always sat to drink wine and discuss their financial plans. But Chloe did not stop there. The next afternoon, she drove to Richard's luxury real estate firm, under the guise of dropping off the blank legal waivers they had forced her husband, Mark, to sign. While Richard stepped out of his executive office to fetch her a cup of coffee, Chloe reached into a large potted fern near his mahogany desk and dropped a second hidden audio recorder deep into the soil. She left the devices running continuously for 3 entire days. She knew her mother and her uncle were arrogant. They believed they were completely invincible. They thought they had perfectly outsmarted everyone, including me, and especially Chloe. They had absolutely no reason to lower their voices or hide their true intentions when they were alone behind closed doors. Just last night, Chloe had gone back and retrieved both devices. She had transferred all the digital audio files onto a single encrypted flash drive. She reached into her bag again and pulled out a small silver USB drive, placing it right next to the microphone on the sticky diner table. I sat there staring at my daughter in absolute pure awe. I had spent the last 48 hours feeling like a complete failure of a man. I felt like I had spent my entire life being a blind, gullible fool. But looking at Chloe, I realized I had done at least one thing perfectly right in my life. I had raised a daughter with a spine made of solid steel. She was brave and brilliant and fiercely loyal. I grabbed the silver flash drive and slipped it securely into my jeans pocket. I threw a $20 bill on the table to cover our untouched tea and coffee. I told Chloe we needed to leave the diner immediately before anyone recognized us sitting together. We walked out into the cold, gray morning air. I told her to follow my pickup truck, and we drove in tandem back to the desolate, overgrown lot behind my original auto repair shop. We stepped inside my freezing, rusted hunting RV. The air was damp and biting cold. I grabbed a thick wool blanket from the small closet and wrapped it tightly around Chloe's shoulders to keep her warm. I dug under my cot and pulled out a battered, heavy laptop I used to keep for basic garage inventory. I plugged the machine into the weak auxiliary battery of the RV and waited agonizingly for the old operating system to boot up. The screen flickered to life, casting a pale blue light across the cramped, dusty space. I took the silver flash drive from my pocket and plugged it into the side of the computer. A folder popped up on the screen containing several dozen long audio files. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs. We were about to listen to the absolute, unvarnished truth. We clicked the very first file. The audio crackled sharply through the tinny laptop speakers. At first, there was nothing but the muffled sound of footsteps and the clinking of glassware. Then a voice came through loud and completely clear. It was Susan. She was laughing. It was a cold, harsh sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up. Then I heard Richard's deep, arrogant voice responding. We sat in that freezing camper for nearly 3 hours, listening to file after file. It was total psychological torture to hear the woman I loved for 40 years speaking about me with such profound, brutal contempt. We listened as Susan and Richard drank wine and meticulously detailed their entire financial heist. They bragged openly about the fake religious charity. Susan laughed as she described how easy it was to convince the church ladies she was opening a fund for the poor. We heard Richard confirming that the $400,000 was sitting safely in a commercial holding account, waiting to be laundered through fake real estate administrative fees. And then we struck the ultimate gold mine. We opened a file recorded late on a Thursday night in Richard's office. The audio was crystal clear. We heard Richard ask Susan if she was worried that I might fight the legal lien on the $6 million business sale. Susan's voice rang out, echoing off the metal walls of my RV. She scoffed and said I was too stupid to understand corporate law. Then she explicitly detailed the forgery. She proudly admitted that she had taken a blank commercial loan document, slipped it into a stack of routine garage invoices 2 years ago, and had me sign it without looking. She admitted she had altered the pages later to create the fake $500,000 debt. I paused the recording. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely control the mouse pad. We had it. We had the exact bulletproof evidence we needed. This was not just a cheating spouse hiding assets. This was a recorded full confession to felony fraud, grand theft, criminal forgery, and financial conspiracy. We could hand this single flash drive over to the district attorney, and Susan and Richard would be arrested before the sun went down. The $6 million would be immediately unfrozen and rightfully returned to my name. We had completely won. I looked over at Chloe with a massive, triumphant smile forming on my tired face. I expected to see relief in her eyes. I expected her to be smiling back. But Chloe was not smiling. She was staring at the laptop screen with a look of absolute sheer terror. She reached out with a trembling finger and pointed at the screen, telling me to keep playing the audio. I frowned and hit the play button again. The recording continued. Richard was congratulating Susan on the brilliant forgery, but then his voice dropped to a serious, hushed tone. He asked Susan what would happen if Chloe decided to tell me the truth. He asked what would happen if my daughter grew a conscience and ruined their perfect plan. Susan's voice came through the speakers, sharp and totally devoid of any maternal love. She said Chloe would never say a word because they had Mark by the throat. Susan then proceeded to detail the exact nature of Mark's medical billing fraud. She named the insurance company. She named the exact dollar amounts Mark had improperly transferred to cover his clinic payroll. She explicitly stated that if Chloe tried to help me, they would anonymously mail the copied clinic ledgers straight to the Federal Medical Board and have Mark thrown into a federal prison. I slammed my hand down on the keyboard, stopping the audio track completely. The heavy silence in the freezing RV was absolutely deafening. I slowly turned to look at my daughter. She was weeping silently, clutching the wool blanket around her chest. The brilliant, triumphant victory I had felt just 10 seconds ago vanished into thin air, replaced by a crushing, suffocating dilemma. The conflict had violently pivoted. I now held the ultimate weapon in my hands. I had the exact legal evidence required to destroy Susan and Richard, to send them to prison, and to recover my entire $6 million life savings. But the very same audio files that proved their criminal guilt also contained the explicit, detailed confession of my son-in-law's medical fraud. If I took this flash drive to my lawyer, or to the police, the authorities would have to listen to the entire recording to verify the extortion and the forgery. The moment the district attorney heard the details of Mark's illegal billing practices, they would be legally obligated to investigate him too. Mark's career would be instantly destroyed. He would lose his medical license, and he could potentially face federal charges. My daughter would be financially ruined, and my innocent grandchildren would have to watch their father go to jail. I sat staring at the glowing laptop screen, my mind racing desperately for a solution. Susan and Richard had built a completely flawless trap. They had tied their own criminal conspiracy directly to Mark's mistake, creating a deadly legal knot. If I fired the bullet to save my own life, the bullet would pass right through Susan and hit my daughter directly in the heart. I had the power to get my $6 million back. But using it meant absolutely destroying the family I had spent my entire life trying to protect. I sat there in the freezing dampness of that old rusted RV, looking at the pale blue light of the laptop screen. My daughter Chloe was weeping silently beside me, pulling the thick wool blanket tightly around her trembling shoulders. Just moments ago, we thought we had found our salvation. We thought we had the absolute, undeniable proof we needed to destroy Susan and her arrogant brother Richard. But then we heard the rest of the recording. We heard my wife, cold and calculating, laying out her sinister plan to destroy my son-in-law's medical career and take my grandchildren away if Chloe dared to warn me about the stolen $6 million. For a long, terrible minute, I felt completely paralyzed. It felt like I was buried alive under a mountain of heavy scrap metal, with no way to breathe. Susan had expertly tied her own massive financial crimes directly to Mark's desperate medical billing mistake. If I took this silver flash drive to the police to save my own life, the resulting investigation would inevitably drag Mark into a federal spotlight. It would ruin his practice, destroy his reputation, and absolutely shatter my daughter's family. Susan had built a flawless psychological prison, but I am a mechanic. I have spent my entire life taking apart incredibly complex, heavily damaged machines. When an engine is completely locked up and the pressure is building to a critical point, you do not just throw your hands up and walk away. You grab a flashlight, you get underneath the heavy steel, and you patiently look for the bypass valve. You look for the one single loose bolt that will relieve the pressure and allow you to dismantle the entire block safely. I reached out and placed my calloused hand on the laptop keyboard. I told Chloe to stop crying and to listen to me very closely. I told her we were not going to panic and we were not going to surrender. I clicked the small mouse pad and hit the play button on the audio file once again. I needed to hear every single word. I needed to let the sheer cruelty of my wife's voice burn into my brain so I could find the flaw in her perfect design. The tinny speakers of the old laptop crackled loudly in the quiet space of the camper. We could hear the crisp, sharp sound of wine being poured into expensive crystal glasses. We heard Richard let out a loud, arrogant laugh. Then Susan's voice floated into the freezing air, crisp and absolutely dripping with pure venom. "Pour me another glass, Richard," she said, her voice echoing off the mahogany walls of his luxury real estate office. I swear to you, I have never felt more relieved in my entire life. 40 years I spent washing the smell of cheap diesel fuel out of that man's filthy work shirts. 40 years playing the dutiful, smiling church wife while he dragged his greasy boots across my clean floors. Well, the old mechanic finally paid off. I watched Chloe flinch, as if she had been physically struck across the face. Hearing her own mother speak about me with such deep, unadulterated hatred was agonizing. But I did not flinch. I just stared at the glowing screen, my heart hardening into a solid block of pure ice. Richard chuckled softly on the recording. "You played it perfectly, Susan," he said. The look on his face at the barbecue when the process server handed him the divorce papers was absolutely priceless. He looked like a lost, pathetic dog. But we still need to be careful. If he gets a decent lawyer, he might try to trace the $400,000 you pulled from the joint accounts. Susan let out a sharp, dismissive scoff. "Let him try," she snapped. "The money is sitting safely inside the Grace and Light community outreach accounts. Because you are the registered agent and the sole director of the charity, there is absolutely no legal paper trail connecting the funds directly to me. I used the church directory to build the donor list. By the time any judge figures out it is a shell corporation, we will have already laundered the cash through your real estate administrative fees. We are going to bleed the old mechanic dry, Richard. Every single penny he broke his back to earn belongs to us now." Then the audio shifted to the topic of the massive $6 million wire transfer from my business sale. Richard sounded incredibly smug as he discussed the forged commercial lien. "I filed the paperwork at the county courthouse this morning," Richard said, the clinking of his wine glass clearly audible. The asset freeze is officially in place. I cannot believe you actually managed to copy his signature so perfectly, Susan. The notary believed it was a legitimate $500,000 commercial loan from 12 years ago without a single second thought. It was easy, Susan replied, her voice completely devoid of any remorse. Tom is a simple, gullible fool. He never read the fine print on any document I put in front of him. I just slipped a blank commercial loan template into a stack of routine garage supply invoices a few years ago. He signed it right on the dotted line, blindly trusting his loving wife. I filled in the loan terms and the compounding interest clauses later. It is a completely airtight forgery. By the time his cheap legal aid lawyers try to fight the authenticity of the contract, the legal fees will leave him absolutely penniless. He will be begging us for a settlement just to survive. I paused the recording for a brief second. My chest was heaving. Hearing her proudly confess to criminal forgery and financial conspiracy was sickening, but it was exactly what I needed. I looked at Chloe. Her eyes were wide with total horror, but I told her to pay very close attention to the next part. I told her this was the exact moment where Susan made her fatal, arrogant mistake. I pressed play. Richard sighed deeply on the recording. It is a brilliant setup, Susan, but we have one major loose end. Chloe. She loves her father. If she figures out what we are doing, or if she decides to grow a conscience and testify against you in family court, she could ruin this entire operation. Susan's voice dropped to a cold, chilling whisper. Do not worry about my daughter, she said maliciously. Chloe is not going to say a single word to her father. I went to her house yesterday, and I made her position very clear. I told the little brat that if she breathes a single word of this to Tom, I will personally take the copied financial ledgers from Mark's clinic and mail them directly to the Federal Medical Board. I told her I will have her precious husband arrested for medical insurance fraud by the end of the week. She was crying like a pathetic child. She knows I will absolutely destroy Mark's medical career and use my new wealth to take full custody of my grandchildren if she disobeys me. She is our silent, inside informant now. She will do exactly what she is told, because she is absolutely terrified of me. I hit the space bar, and the audio stopped, abruptly plunging the cold RV back into total silence. Chloe buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly. She told me she was so sorry. She told me she felt like a coward for letting her mother back her into such a terrifying corner. I reached out and gently pulled her hands away from her face. I looked my beautiful daughter right in the eyes, and I smiled. It was the first genuine smile I had managed to form since the day of the barbecue. Chloe, I said, my voice steady and completely filled with renewed strength. Do you not see what you just did? Do you not realize what you just captured on this recording? She sniffled, looking at me with total confusion. I captured her threatening to destroy Mark, she whispered. I captured her holding our entire family hostage. If we use this tape, she will send Mark to federal prison. No, she will not, I said, shaking my head slowly. Chloe, listen to me. What your mother just described on this tape is not a simple family threat. It is explicit textbook criminal extortion. It is severe federal blackmail. By explicitly stating that she is using the knowledge of Mark's medical billing error to force you to participate in a massive financial fraud against me, she just handed us the ultimate shield. I watched the realization slowly begin to dawn in Chloe's tired, tear-filled eyes. I continued explaining the legal reality to her. If we take this tape to the authorities, Susan cannot simply report Mark out of spite. The moment a federal prosecutor hears this recording, they will instantly recognize that Mark is a victim of severe criminal extortion. Any attempt Susan makes to report the clinic will be seen as malicious retaliation by a desperate criminal facing decades in prison for grand theft and forgery. The federal authorities do not care about a young doctor's panicked billing mistake when they have a highly calculated $6 million fraud and extortion ring staring them right in the face. This recording does not destroy Mark. This recording completely protects him. Chloe gasped sharply, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. The sheer overwhelming relief that washed over her exhausted face was beautiful to witness. The heavy, suffocating chains her mother had wrapped around her neck instantly shattered into dust. She threw her arms around my neck, burying her face in my heavy flannel shirt, crying tears of pure, unadulterated joy. I held my daughter tightly in the freezing dampness of that old camper, feeling the righteous protective fire burning bright in my soul. I was a father again. I was the protector, and I was going to absolutely obliterate the people who dared to threaten my family. The very next morning, I did not go to a cheap legal aid clinic. I did not call a friendly neighborhood attorney. I took the small amount of emergency cash Chloe forced me to borrow from her savings, and I drove straight downtown to the most expensive, ruthless, high-stakes law firm in the entire state. I walked into a towering glass building wearing my cleanest pair of denim jeans and my heavy work boots. I asked the polished receptionist for a consultation with their top litigator. She looked at my calloused hands and my worn jacket with obvious hesitation, but she eventually led me into a massive corner office overlooking the city skyline. The man sitting behind the sprawling oak desk was named Victor Harrison. He was in his late 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes, a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, and the calm, dangerous demeanor of a hungry great white shark. He did not judge my appearance. He simply offered me a firm handshake, a cup of hot black coffee, and asked me to tell him my story. I sat down in the plush leather chair and laid everything out on the table. I told him about the 40 years of grueling labor. I told him about the $6 million business sale, the shocking divorce ambush, the changed locks, the stolen $400,000 hidden in the fake religious charity, and the forged commercial lien designed to freeze my entire payout. Victor listened quietly, taking meticulous notes on a legal pad, never interrupting me once. Then I reached into my pocket and placed the small silver flash drive directly onto his pristine desk. I told him it contained over 12 hours of continuous audio secretly recorded in the private offices of the conspirators. I told him it contained explicit voluntary confessions to felony forgery, grand theft, money laundering, and severe criminal extortion involving my daughter and my son-in-law. Victor Harrison's eyes locked on to the small silver device. He picked it up thoughtfully, plugged it into his sleek desktop computer, and put on a pair of heavy noise-canceling headphones. He sat there in total silence for 45 minutes, clicking through the specific timestamps I had written down on a piece of paper. I watched his face closely. I watched the initial professional curiosity slowly transform into absolute predatory delight. When he finally pulled the headphones off and looked back at me, there was a cold, ruthless smile playing on his lips. "Tom," he said, his voice practically vibrating with intense professional excitement. "In my 30 years of practicing high-stakes corporate and family law, I have never seen a client walk into my office holding a smoking gun this incredibly massive. Your wife and your brother-in-law have not just committed marital asset fraud. They have built an elaborate criminal enterprise. The forgery, the fake religious charity, and the explicit extortion of your daughter elevate this from a simple, nasty divorce into a massive federal criminal indictment. We have them absolutely dead to rights." I let out a long, heavy sigh, feeling a massive, crushing weight finally lifting off my tired shoulders. "So we take it to the judge," I said, leaning forward. "We file the audio files today, we unfreeze my $6 million, and we have them arrested." Victor held up a single manicured hand, stopping me instantly. "No," he said, his voice dropping to a low, serious pitch. We absolutely do not strike yet. If we dump this evidence into the discovery file right now, Susan and Richard's expensive corporate lawyers will immediately panic. They will stall the proceedings. They will try to claim the recordings were obtained illegally. They will try to desperately negotiate a closed-door settlement to avoid prison time. I do not want them to negotiate, Tom. I want them completely, utterly destroyed. I looked at him confused. How do we do that, Victor? How do we guarantee they lose everything? We let your wife dig her own grave, Victor explained, leaning across the wide oak desk. The most powerful weapon in any courtroom is not just a secret audio recording. It is the crime of perjury. We need to let Susan walk into that federal courtroom feeling absolutely invincible. We need her to sit in the witness stand, place her hand on a holy Bible, and swear an oath to tell the truth. We need to let her tell the judge her completely fabricated story about the charity, the loan, and your alleged abusive behavior. We let her build her massive tower of lies directly into the official court record. And then when she is completely exposed and entirely confident, we detonate the bomb. When a judge catches a litigant committing severe intentional perjury while attempting to steal millions of dollars, the wrath of the court is absolutely biblical. They will not just lose the divorce settlement. They will go directly to a federal penitentiary. I sat back in my chair, letting the brilliant, vicious strategy wash over me. It was flawless. It was the ultimate fatal trap. But Victor warned me it would require the hardest acting job of my entire life. Until that final court date arrives, Victor said, looking me straight in the eyes, you have to play the broken, defeated old man perfectly. You have to sit in the preliminary mediations with your head bowed. You have to let her lawyers insult you, humiliate you, and paint you as a bitter, pathetic mechanic who lost his mind. You cannot show a single ounce of confidence. You cannot let her see the fire in your eyes. You have to let Susan believe she has completely broken your spirit. Can you do that, Tom? Can you sit across a table from the woman who betrayed you and swallow your pride until the trap snaps shut? I thought about the freezing, miserable nights sleeping in my rusted RV. I thought about the fake charity using my community church as a shield. I thought about the sheer malicious evil in Susan's voice when she explicitly threatened to destroy my innocent grandchildren just to protect her stolen money. I looked at Victor Harrison and gave him a slow, chilling smile. I have spent my entire life biting my tongue and working quietly in the background while other people took the credit, I said, my voice rumbling with absolute iron resolve. I can play the broken mechanic one last time. Let her build her tower of lies, Victor. I cannot wait to watch it collapse right on top of her. I was sitting on the edge of the narrow, uncomfortable cot in my freezing, rusted camper when the heavy knock pounded against the thin metal door. It had been exactly 3 days since my secretive meeting with my ruthless new attorney, Victor Harrison. I slowly stood up, my old joints aching from the damp, cold air, and pulled the door open. A young man wearing a cheap gray suit handed me a thick, heavy stack of legal documents wrapped in a thick rubber band. He did not say a single word as he turned and walked quickly away through the overgrown weeds of the abandoned lot. I closed the metal door and sat back down on the cot. I pulled the rubber band off the thick stack of papers, and my rough, calloused hands began to tremble as I scanned the dense legal text. Susan and her high-priced, aggressive lawyers had officially launched their opening legal salvo, and it was absolutely brutal. It was an emergency ex parte order filed directly with the county family court. Susan was formally claiming to a judge that I was mentally unstable, violently erratic, and desperately trying to hide the $6 million from the sale of my commercial auto repair business. She completely fabricated horrific stories of me throwing heavy steel tools across the garage and screaming at her in the middle of the dark night. She claimed in these official legal documents that she was utterly terrified for her physical safety and needed the court to grant her immediate sole control of all our marital assets to prevent me from liquidating them and fleeing the state. Reading those vile, twisted lies printed on official watermarked court letterhead made my empty stomach churn with violent sickness. I felt a hot, sudden flash of intense rage rise up in my throat, choking me. I had spent 40 long years breaking my back and ruining my spine to give that woman a life of pure, absolute luxury. I had never raised my voice to her in anger. I had never lifted a single finger to cause her harm. And now she was painting me as an abusive, terrifying monster just to steal my life savings and justify locking me out of my own home. I picked up my cell phone and immediately called Victor Harrison. He answered on the first ring. I read the disgusting accusations to him, my voice shaking with raw fury. Victor remained completely calm. He told me to take a deep breath. He told me this was exactly what we wanted her to do. He explained that she was actively putting her massive lies into the official legal record under the penalty of perjury. She was proudly building her own towering monument of deceit. Victor told me our first preliminary mediation session was scheduled for Friday morning at her lawyer's downtown office. He firmly reminded me of our secret mission. I had to walk into that sterile room and let them completely humiliate me. I had to let them think they were absolutely winning the war. Friday morning arrived with a cold, biting wind that swept across the gray city. I deliberately put on my worn, faded denim jeans, a threadbare flannel work shirt, and my heavy, scuffed steel toe boots. Victor had explicitly instructed me not to dress up in a suit. He wanted me to look exactly like the broken, defeated blue-collar mechanic Susan claimed I was. I drove my rusted pickup truck to the glittering, towering glass skyscraper downtown and rode the silent elevator up to the luxurious mediation offices on the 40th floor. Victor met me in the plush, carpeted hallway. He looked incredibly sharp and dangerous in his dark, custom charcoal suit, but he offered me a reassuring, steady nod. We walked together into a massive, sterile conference room. The walls were made of thick, frosted glass, and a long, polished oak table dominated the center of the cold room. I sat down in a heavy leather chair next to Victor and clasped my rough, calloused hands tightly in my lap. 10 minutes later, the heavy glass door swung open. Susan walked into the room wearing an immaculate white designer dress, her hair perfectly styled, and her expensive makeup flawless. She looked like a wealthy, tragic, grieving victim. Richard walked in right behind her, wearing a custom-tailored navy blue suit and a smug, incredibly arrogant smirk on his face. They were flanked by two incredibly expensive, aggressive corporate lawyers who looked at me like I was a piece of filthy dirt stuck to the bottom of their expensive Italian leather shoes. Susan did not even look at me. She sat down directly across from me and delicately folded her manicured hands on the polished oak table. The court-appointed mediator, a quiet older man with thin glasses, sat at the head of the long table and began reading the basic procedural rules of the mediation. But my ears were ringing loudly. The sheer, heavy psychological weight of sitting across the table from the woman I had loved and implicitly trusted for 4 decades was incredibly suffocating. This was the woman who had kissed me good morning every single day of my adult life. This was the woman who had slept next to me every night in the beautiful home I built for us. And now she was sitting 3 feet away, coldly preparing to slaughter me for money. The mediation officially began, and Susan's lead attorney immediately went on a vicious attack. He was a slick, aggressive man who spoke with a loud, booming, theatrical voice. He aggressively opened his thick black binder and started listing my alleged horrific failures as a husband and a business owner. He painted a vivid, false picture of a bitter, uneducated blue-collar worker who had completely lost his mind due to age and stress. He told the mediator that I had grown violent and dangerously erratic over the past 5 years. He blatantly claimed I was desperately trying to hide our marital assets out of pure spite and malice. He aggressively referenced the forged commercial lien that Richard had filed at the courthouse, claiming I was trying to cowardly run away from a legitimate $500,000 family loan. I sat there with my head bowed exactly as Victor had strictly instructed me to do. I stared down at my rough, cracked hands resting on my denim jeans. Every single natural instinct in my entire body screamed at me to stand up and flip the heavy oak table over. I wanted to yell at the top of my lungs. I wanted to pull the small silver flash drive out of my jacket pocket and play the secret recording right then and there to destroy their smug faces. I wanted to expose their disgusting fake religious charity and their malicious, terrifying extortion of my innocent daughter, Chloe. But I bit my tongue so hard I tasted metallic blood in my mouth. I felt Victor shift slightly in his chair next to me, offering a silent, physical reminder to stay the course and hold my temper. I gripped the underside edge of the heavy oak table, letting the rough wood dig deeply into my calloused fingers to physically ground myself in the room. Then the mediator asked Susan if she wanted to add a statement. I slowly raised my eyes just enough to look at her face. She pulled a pristine white tissue from her expensive designer purse and delicately dabbed at the corners of her eyes. She actually managed to produce real, wet tears. She looked at the mediator, her lower lip trembling in a perfect display of fabricated sorrow. She said she had spent 40 long years trying to be a good, faithful Christian wife to a man who never truly appreciated her sacrifices. She said she had lived in constant, terrifying fear of my volatile, explosive temper for the last decade of our marriage. She boldly claimed she only took the $400,000 from our joint accounts because she was absolutely terrified I would maliciously leave her destitute on the street with nothing. It was a masterful, breathtaking theatrical performance. If I had not sat in my freezing camper and heard the secret audio recording of her drinking wine and laughing cruelly about bleeding me completely dry, I might have actually believed her myself. The absolute sheer profound evil of her deceit was physically paralyzing. I looked over at Richard sitting next to her. He was leaning back comfortably in his plush leather chair, watching his sister perform with a look of deep, arrogant satisfaction. He caught my eye across the table and offered a tiny, mocking, dismissive smile. He truly thought I was completely broken. He thought I was just a tired, ignorant old man who did not understand how the modern legal world worked. He thought his forged documents and his slick, aggressive lawyers had cornered me into absolute pathetic submission. I lowered my head again, taking a slow, deep, agonizing breath. Let them talk, I told myself silently over and over again. Let them build the trap higher and higher. Every single lie she told in this room would soon become the very rope that would hang her in federal court. The psychological toll of that 2-hour mediation session was far heavier than any transmission block I had ever hoisted in my garage. To sit perfectly still and listen to your entire life being shredded into ugly little lies is a unique and agonizing kind of mental torture. They maliciously twisted every good, honest thing I had ever done. When I worked late, exhausting nights at the shop to pay off our mortgage early, they called it emotional neglect. When I carefully managed the shop finances to keep us completely out of debt, they called it aggressive financial abuse. Susan spun a totally fabricated narrative that completely erased my decades of love and sacrifice. I felt my chest tighten with a profound, heavy sorrow. I had given this woman my youth, my health, my physical strength, and my absolute unwavering devotion. I had destroyed my spine and ruined my joints to build our auto repair empire and give her a beautiful life. And she sat there in her expensive white dress, casually dismantling my humanity for a few extra $1 million. I felt a sudden, desperate, suffocating urge to look at Victor and beg him to stop the humiliating charade and end the nightmare immediately. But then I remembered Chloe. I remembered my beautiful, terrified daughter crying breathlessly in the dingy diner booth, begging me to save her husband from federal prison. Susan and Richard were not just trying to steal my hard-earned money. They were actively, violently blackmailing my child. They were explicitly threatening to destroy my innocent grandchildren's lives just to protect their stolen wealth. That powerful thought instantly burned away my sorrow and replaced it with a cold, highly calculated fury. I stopped feeling sad for the bitter end of my long marriage. I stopped mourning the woman I foolishly thought Susan was. I realized with absolute clarity she was nothing but a greedy parasite and a ruthless predator, and I was going to let her walk blindly right into the crushing jaws of justice. As the grueling mediation drew to a close, it became completely obvious to everyone in the room that no friendly settlement would be reached. Victor played his part brilliantly. He acted exactly like a frustrated, defeated defense attorney who knew he had an incredibly weak losing hand. He offered a few meager, pathetic compromises, suggesting we split the remaining business sale funds evenly and drop the legal issue of the missing $400,000. Susan's slick-lead attorney actually laughed out loud at the offer. He slammed his thick black binder shut and leaned aggressively across the oak table. They completely and utterly rejected every single offer we made. They did not want a fair, equitable compromise. They wanted absolute total financial annihilation. Susan's lawyer formally stated their final absolute demands for the upcoming court trial. He proudly announced that Susan was officially filing for 100% of the $6 million business payout. She was filing for permanent lifelong alimony to be paid directly from my small remaining personal retirement accounts. She was fiercely demanding that the court fully validate Richard's forged $500,000 lien with full compounding interest added. And as the absolute final crushing insult, she was filing a legal order to force me to pay every single penny of her exorbitant corporate legal fees. They were actively trying to leave me with massive crippling debt while they walked away with a massive stolen fortune. The mediator formally declared an official impasse and stated clearly that the case would proceed to a full evidentiary hearing in front of a family court judge in exactly 2 weeks. Susan stood up gracefully from the table, smoothing out the invisible wrinkles in her pristine white dress. She looked down at me with an expression of pure, icy contempt. She did not say a single word to me, but her cold eyes communicated absolutely everything. She fully believed she had already won the war. She believed I was a pathetic, helpless, wounded animal, waiting quietly for the final slaughter. Richard buttoned his custom suit jacket and offered me one last condescending smirk before following his sister out the heavy frosted glass doors. Their aggressive lawyers packed up their thick binders and strutted confidently out of the room, leaving Victor and me sitting completely alone in the quiet, sterile space. I sat there in the sudden, heavy silence, staring at the empty leather chairs across the long oak table. My calloused hands were still clenched incredibly tight, resting heavily on my denim thighs. My breathing was slow and perfectly measured. Victor leaned over and put his hand firmly on my shoulder. "You did perfectly, Tom," he said, his voice low and thrumming with intense professional anticipation. They took the bait completely and swallowed the hook. They have officially submitted all their fraudulent claims and forged documents into the permanent legal court record. They have confidently locked themselves into their own massive lies. There is absolutely no turning back for them now. I nodded slowly, unfolding my stiff, aching hands. The emotional exhaustion was incredibly heavy, but the fierce, burning determination in my soul kept me incredibly alert. The malicious smear campaign had been vicious and cruel. The deliberate humiliation had been profound and painful. They had painted me as a violent monster and aggressively demanded my complete financial ruin. But they had absolutely no idea that they had just armed the very bomb that would destroy their lives forever. The legal stage was finally perfectly set for the ultimate courtroom showdown. Susan desperately wanted to stand in front of a federal judge and swear a holy oath to her fabricated story. I was going to let her. I was going to let her climb right up onto that wooden witness stand and smile her fake, innocent smile. And then I was going to unleash the devastating recorded truth and watch her entire criminal empire burn entirely to the ground. I stood up from the heavy oak table, pushing my leather chair back. I looked at Victor Harrison and told him I was absolutely ready. The old broken mechanic had quietly survived their brutal legal onslaught. Now it was finally time to drop the heavy steel hammer. The morning of the final family court hearing was bitterly cold. The sky above the city was a bruised, heavy gray that perfectly matched the massive stone pillars of the federal courthouse. I walked up the wide concrete steps, feeling the immense, crushing weight of my 68 years in every single joint of my body. I wore a simple faded gray suit. It was the only formal suit I owned, and I had bought it straight off the rack a decade ago for a funeral. The fabric was a little tight across my broad shoulders, but my attorney Victor Harrison had explicitly told me to wear it. He wanted me to look exactly like the man I truly was. He wanted the judge to see a tired, broken old mechanic who had worked his entire life doing heavy manual labor just to be dragged into this sterile, unforgiving place. I pulled open the heavy brass doors of the courthouse and stepped into the warm, bustling lobby. My calloused hands were sweating slightly, but my mind was completely clear. Victor was already waiting for me outside the heavy double doors of courtroom number 4. He looked like a dangerous, silent predator. His custom-tailored black suit was absolutely flawless, and his posture was perfectly relaxed. Unlike the other lawyers rushing down the hallway, carrying massive cardboard boxes full of legal binders, Victor carried only a single thin leather folder. He did not need a mountain of paperwork today. The only thing he needed was the small silver flash drive safely secured in his breast pocket. He placed his hand firmly on my shoulder and told me to remember our strategy. He told me to sit perfectly still, to keep my eyes cast downward, and to let them dig their own grave as deep as they possibly could. I nodded slowly, taking a deep, steady breath of the stale courthouse air. We pushed open the heavy wooden doors and walked down the center aisle. The courtroom was vast and intimidating. High-vaulted ceilings and dark oak wood paneling made the space feel incredibly oppressive and cold. I sat down at the heavy defense table and rested my rough, cracked hands on the polished wood. I kept my head bowed exactly as Victor had instructed me to do. I listened closely to the sound of footsteps behind me, knowing my entire life was about to be laid out on the butcher block. The heavy doors at the back of the room opened again. I did not even have to look up to know it was her. I could smell her expensive, sweet floral perfume filling the enclosed space. Susan walked slowly down the center aisle, surrounded by her team of aggressive, highly paid corporate lawyers. She was dressed absolutely perfectly for the tragic role she was about to play. She wore a modest, conservative navy blue dress that reached below her knees. Her blonde hair was pulled back simply and neatly. She wore minimal makeup, intentionally making her face look pale, exhausted, and incredibly fragile. She looked exactly like a terrified, emotionally abused woman seeking shelter from a monster. It was an absolute masterclass in visual deception and psychological manipulation. She sat down at the plaintiff table gracefully and did not look in my direction even once. I risked a very quick glance over my right shoulder toward the wooden gallery benches at the back of the room. Richard was sitting right in the middle of the very front row. He wore a sharp silver suit, a crisp white shirt, and a patterned silk tie. He leaned back against the hard wooden bench, crossing his legs comfortably and resting his arms across the back of the seat. When he saw me looking at him, he offered a slow, incredibly arrogant smirk. He looked completely relaxed and triumphant. He truly thought he was attending my financial execution. He firmly believed his forged commercial loan documents and his fake religious charity scheme were absolutely bulletproof. He thought his blackmail plot against my daughter had completely neutralized any chance I had of fighting back. I turned my eyes back to the front of the room and stared blankly at the empty judge's bench, letting the anger burn silently in my chest. The bailiff loudly announced the arrival of the judge and ordered everyone in the room to rise. Judge Eleanor Vance walked in from her private chambers. She was a stern, older woman with sharp, penetrating eyes and a fierce, no-nonsense reputation in the family court circuit. She sat down, arranged her heavy black robes, and ordered us all to be seated. The courtroom fell completely silent. The sheer, crushing gravity of the moment settled heavily on my lungs. This was it. This was the final, ultimate battle for my life, savings, my reputation, and my basic human dignity. Susan's slick-lead attorney immediately stood up and formally requested to call his very first witness to the stand. He called Susan. The entire courtroom watched in absolute silence as she slowly walked up the short wooden steps to the witness box. She placed her left hand gently on the Holy Bible and raised her right hand. She swore a sacred binding oath before God and the court to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. She sat down in the wooden witness chair and folded her trembling hands delicately in her lap. I watched her take that solemn oath, and I felt a freezing cold chill run straight down my spine. The woman I had loved and trusted for 40 years was about to commit massive intentional perjury in a federal courtroom to steal the money I had broken my back to earn. Her aggressive corporate lawyer approached the wooden podium and adjusted his microphone. He spoke to Susan in a soft, incredibly sympathetic tone. He gently asked her to describe the reality of our 40-year marriage to the judge. Susan took a shaky, ragged breath. She looked down at her folded hands and let a single perfect tear roll down her pale cheek. She looked up at the judge and stated that our marriage had been a terrifying living nightmare. She claimed that behind closed doors, I was a bitter, volatile, violent monster. She said that as my commercial auto repair business grew more successful and demanding, my temper grew increasingly dangerous. She completely fabricated horrific, detailed stories about me coming home late at night, smelling of cheap whiskey, and screaming at her until she locked herself in the guest bedroom, crying in fear. She wept openly and convincingly as she told the judge about a night that absolutely never happened. She claimed I flew into a blind rage in our garage and threw a heavy steel wrench directly at her head, missing her skull by mere inches. She told the court she had lived the last decade of her life in constant, suffocating terror, always walking on eggshells to avoid triggering my explosive wrath. I sat there at the defense table feeling a hot, blinding rage burning like battery acid in my stomach. I gripped the thick edge of the heavy wooden table so hard my swollen knuckles cracked loudly in the quiet room. I wanted to stand up and shout until my lungs bled. I wanted to tell the judge that I had never tasted whiskey in my entire life because I had to be at the shop every morning at 5 o'clock. I wanted to tell the court that the only reason I ever came home late was because I was working grueling double shifts, crawling under heavy leaking diesel trucks, so Susan could buy imported Italian furniture for her pristine living room. I had permanently destroyed my spine and ruined my knees to give her a life of total, absolute luxury. and she sat there in the witness stand, wiping away fake tears and shredding my basic humanity just to secure a few extra $1 million. Victor bumped his knee hard against mine under the table, delivering a silent, harsh command to remain perfectly still. I forced myself to swallow the bitter metallic anger and kept my head bowed in silent, absolute submission. The lawyer then gently guided her to the complex topic of our current finances. He asked her to explain to the court exactly why she had changed the locks on our family home and thrown me out into the street. Susan looked up at the judge with wide, terrified, innocent eyes. She said she had recently discovered I was planning to secretly sell my commercial auto business for $6 million and run away to another state. She claimed I was deliberately going to leave her completely destitute and penniless after 40 years of marriage. She said she only changed the locks and served me with divorce papers because she was genuinely afraid I would come back and physically hurt her when she confronted me about the hidden money. Then the lawyer brought up the massive elephant in the room. He brought up the $400,000 missing from our joint checking accounts. He asked her directly where that massive amount of cash had gone. Susan did not even blink. Her breathing remained perfectly steady. She swore under oath that I must have secretly withdrawn and hidden the cash to ruin her. She looked the judge right in the eye and stated she had absolutely no knowledge of any missing funds. The lawyer specifically asked her if she knew anything about an organization called Grace and Light Community Outreach. Susan shook her head, looking completely baffled and confused by the question. She stated clearly and loudly for the official court record that she had never heard of that religious charity in her entire life. She flatly denied having any involvement with a hidden shell corporation. She denied knowing that her brother Richard was the registered agent holding the money. She lied with such breathtaking absolute confidence that it was almost terrifying to witness. I glanced back at Richard in the gallery. He was nodding slowly, watching his sister deliver the theatrical performance of a lifetime. They had completely locked themselves into their massive criminal deception. Every single word Susan spoke into the microphone was another heavy iron nail hammered directly into her own coffin. The judge was taking careful, continuous notes, looking over at me with obvious, deep disgust. The entire courtroom completely believed Susan's tragic, fabricated story. They saw a brave, abused woman finally standing up to her wealthy, cruel monster of a husband. They thought I was a vile abuser trying to maliciously steal her rightful half of the business sale. Susan's lawyer finally concluded his long, direct examination by asking her what she wanted the court to do today to protect her. Susan looked directly at the judge, her voice trembling in a perfect display of vulnerability. She asked the court to award her the full 100% of the $6 million business sale to protect her future safety. She explicitly asked the judge to validate the $500,000 commercial lien filed by her brother Richard, claiming it was a legitimate, generous family loan that had saved our business many years ago. And finally, she asked the judge for a permanent lifetime restraining order to keep me away from her forever. She bowed her head and wept softly into a clean white tissue. Her lawyer thanked her and walked confidently back to his table, looking incredibly proud of his work. The judge turned her sharp, cold gaze toward our defense table. She asked Victor Harrison if the defense wished to cross-examine the witness. The courtroom fell perfectly, deathly silent. This was the exact moment everyone in the room expected my high-priced lawyer to stand up and aggressively attack Susan's credibility. This was the moment they expected us to fight back with angry, desperate denials and wild accusations. Instead, Victor stood up incredibly slowly, leisurely, buttoning his custom charcoal suit jacket. He looked up at the judge with complete, absolute, predatory calm. He stated clearly and smoothly that the defense had absolutely no questions for Susan at this time. A visible heavy ripple of pure confusion swept rapidly through the entire courtroom. Susan's aggressive corporate lawyers immediately exchanged baffled, nervous looks. Susan paused, her soft crying lowering her tissue, and staring down at Victor with a sudden sharp flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. The judge raised her eyebrows, completely surprised by the incredibly unusual passive strategy. The judge leaned forward and asked Victor if he was absolutely sure he wanted to completely waive his right to cross-examine the plaintiff after such severe damning allegations were placed permanently on the official record. Victor smiled, a very small, incredibly dangerous smile. He told the judge he was absolutely certain. He told the court that he preferred to let the plaintiff's sworn testimony stand exactly as it was without a single challenge. The judge frowned deeply, but nodded slowly, telling Susan she was excused and could step down from the witness stand. Susan walked slowly back to her table, looking slightly unnerved by our total lack of a fight. She sat down and glanced back at Richard in the gallery, seeking reassurance. Richard gave her a slight dismissive shrug, and his arrogant, confident smirk quickly returned to his face. They assumed Victor was simply a terrible, unprepared lawyer. They assumed I had completely surrendered to my fate. They truly thought they had backed us into a dark corner we could not possibly escape from. The judge looked down at Victor and asked if the defense wished to call any witnesses to the stand to testify on my behalf. Victor stepped out from behind our heavy wooden table and walked slowly, deliberately into the very center of the quiet courtroom. Victor looked at the judge and stated that the defense would like to call its first and only witness for the day. The entire room waited in heavy, suffocating anticipation. Victor slowly turned his body, looking directly at Susan, and then shifted his cold gaze to the heavy wooden double doors at the very back of the courtroom. He called my daughter Chloe to the stand. The heavy oak doors slowly pushed open, groaning loudly in the silent room. Every single head in the courtroom turned instantly to look. Susan immediately smiled. A wide, incredibly triumphant, glowing smile spread across her pale face. She turned around to look at Richard in the gallery, and they shared a long look of absolute sheer victory. They thought my own daughter was walking into this courtroom right now to deliver the final brutal killing blow. They thought their malicious, cruel blackmail had worked absolutely perfectly. They fully confidently believed Chloe was about to sit in that wooden witness chair and completely corroborate every single vicious, fabricated lie Susan had just told the judge. They thought Chloe was going to tell the court that I was an abusive, terrifying father and a terrible, violent husband just to protect her own husband's medical career from their vicious extortion. They thought they completely and totally owned her soul. They had absolutely no idea that Chloe was not walking down that center aisle as their terrified inside informant. Chloe was walking down that aisle as the executioner. Chloe walked slowly down the center aisle of the massive federal courtroom. Her footsteps echoed lightly against the polished hardwood floor. She wore a simple, modest gray sweater and dark slacks. She kept her eyes fixed straight ahead. I watched my beautiful daughter take the heavy wooden steps up to the witness box. Susan turned around in her seat at the plaintiff table. She smiled a wide, confident, glowing smile at Chloe. Susan truly believed she had won the ultimate victory. She thought her cruel, malicious blackmail had worked perfectly. She fully expected her terrified daughter to sit in that wooden chair and tell the judge that I was a violent, abusive monster. Susan thought Chloe was going to deliver the final killing blow to my life. The bailiff asked Chloe to place her hand on the Holy Bible and swear to tell the truth. Chloe placed her small, trembling hand on the worn leather cover. She swore the sacred oath, her voice quiet, but incredibly steady. She sat down in the wooden witness chair and folded her hands in her lap. She refused to look at her mother. She kept her eyes locked securely on Victor Harrison. Victor stood in the very center of the courtroom, looking completely relaxed and totally in control. Victor approached the wooden podium and adjusted his suit jacket. He spoke to Chloe in a calm, gentle, reassuring tone. He asked her to state her name for the official court record. Chloe stated her name clearly. Victor then asked her if she was aware of the severe allegations her mother had just made against me under the penalty of perjury. Chloe nodded and said she heard every single word her mother had spoken. Victor leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the edges of the wooden podium. He asked Chloe to tell the judge the absolute truth about her parents. He asked her to describe exactly what kind of man her father was and what kind of woman her mother truly was. The entire courtroom held its collective breath. Susan's slick, aggressive lawyers sat back in their leather chairs, looking incredibly smug. They were waiting for the final nail to be driven into my coffin. Susan leaned forward with a look of pure theatrical sorrow on her face, ready to listen to her daughter corroborate her massive lies. Chloe took a deep, ragged breath. She gripped the edges of the wooden witness box so hard her knuckles turned white. She lifted her chin and looked directly at the stern federal judge. "My father is a good man," she said, her voice ringing out crystal clear and echoing off the dark oak-paneled walls. "My father sacrificed his entire life to provide for our family. He ruined his spine working 14-hour shifts in a freezing garage to give us a beautiful home. He is the kindest, most honest man I have ever known." Chloe paused for a fraction of a second. She finally turned her head and looked directly down at Susan. Susan was staring back at her with wide, terrified eyes. The smug, confident smile had instantly vanished from Susan's face, replaced by a look of absolute sheer panic. "My mother is a criminal," Chloe stated, her voice rising with fierce, undeniable strength. "My mother is a manipulative, malicious predator. She stole my father's entire life savings. She forged a fake commercial lien to freeze his business payout. She created a fake religious charity to launder his money. And she explicitly threatened to destroy my husband's medical career and take my children away from me if I did not come into this courtroom today and lie to you." The courtroom completely erupted. Susan's lead attorney jumped to his feet, knocking his heavy leather chair backward. He practically screamed his objections, waving his arms frantically in the air. He demanded the judge strike the testimony from the official record, claiming my daughter was completely delusional and maliciously biased. Susan buried her face in her hands, sobbing loudly and pretending to be absolutely devastated by her daughter's supposed betrayal. The judge slammed her heavy wooden gavel down on the sound block several times, demanding absolute order in her courtroom. Victor Harrison did not flinch. He waited for the shouting to stop and the room to fall back into a heavy, suffocating silence. He calmly reached into his custom-tailored suit jacket and pulled out the small silver flash drive. He held it up in the air for the judge to see. He told the court that he did not expect them to simply take Chloe's word for it. He stated that the defense had legally obtained hours of crystal-clear audio recordings. He explained that these digital files contained the explicit voluntary confessions of both Susan and her brother, Richard, directly plotting their massive financial crimes and their vicious extortion scheme. Susan's lawyers instantly panicked. They began shouting overlapping objections, claiming the recordings were illegally obtained and completely inadmissible. Victor smoothly reminded the judge that the recordings were made in a shared family home by a legal resident of that home and in a commercial office building with zero expectation of absolute privacy. The judge stared down at the silver flash drive with intense, penetrating eyes. She looked at Susan's frantic, sweating lawyers, and then at Victor. She ordered the bailiff to take the flash drive and plug it into the courtroom's central audio-visual system. She explicitly overruled every single objection from the plaintiff table. The judge stated that considering the massive severity of the criminal allegations, She was going to hear the evidence immediately. The bailiff connected the silver drive to a heavy black laptop sitting on the clerk's desk. He routed the sound through the massive speakers mounted high on the courtroom walls. Victor provided the bailiff with a specific timestamp. The entire room fell into a deathly, terrifying silence. Even the aggressive corporate lawyers stopped breathing. I sat at the defense table perfectly still, staring straight ahead. I felt a deep, profound sense of righteous justice settling into my tired bones. The trap I had patiently built in the dark was finally springing shut in the bright fluorescent light of the federal courthouse. A sharp crackle of static hissed through the overhead speakers. Then the audio began to play. The sound of wine pouring into crystal glasses echoed loudly through the silent room. Richard's deep, arrogant voice filled the cavernous space. We heard him laughing maliciously. Then Susan's voice rang out clear, crisp, and absolutely dripping with pure venom. We all listened as she complained about the smell of diesel fuel on my work shirts. We listened as she openly bragged about playing the dutiful, smiling church wife while secretly planning my absolute financial destruction. I watched Susan's face as her own toxic voice echoed down from the ceiling. All the blood completely drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking like a pale, sickly ghost. Her pristine white designer dress suddenly looked like a cheap Halloween costume. She stared at the speaker boxes with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. She was physically trembling in her leather chair. The recording continued playing relentlessly. Susan proudly explained exactly how she had created the fake religious charity. She laughed as she described tricking the sweet elderly ladies at our church into believing she was raising money for poor local families. She explicitly detailed how Richard was the sole registered agent of the Shell Corporation specifically designated to quietly launder my $400,000 through fake real estate administrative fees. Then the audio shifted to the forged commercial lien. Richard sounded incredibly smug as he congratulated Susan on perfectly forging my signature on the blank loan template. Susan laughed again, a cold, harsh sound that made the judge physically recoil in disgust. Susan openly admitted to slipping the blank document into a stack of routine garage supply invoices 2 years ago. She bragged about altering the pages later to create a completely fake $500,000 debt explicitly designed to freeze my $6 million business payout. She stated she wanted to bleed the old mechanic completely dry until I had absolutely nothing left but the clothes on my back. The slick corporate lawyers sitting next to Susan physically shifted away from her. They pushed their chairs a few inches to the left, actively distancing themselves from the radioactive toxic waste she had just become. They realized in that exact horrifying moment that their client had actively used them to commit severe federal crimes and massive court perjury. They looked absolutely terrified for their own legal licenses, but Victor was not finished. He nodded to the bailiff, signaling him to skip to the final most damning timestamp on the silver flash drive. The audio skipped forward a few seconds. We heard Richard ask Susan what they would do if Chloe decided to grow a conscience and tell me the truth. Susan's voice dropped to a cold, chilling, malicious whisper on the recording. The entire courtroom listened as my wife coldly outlined her vicious blackmail plot against her own daughter. She explicitly detailed Mark's panicked medical billing mistake. She stated the exact dollar amounts and the name of the insurance company. She proudly declared that she had gone to Chloe's house and threatened to mail the copied financial ledgers directly to the Federal Medical Board. We all heard Susan swear that she would send her son-in-law to a federal penitentiary and use her stolen wealth to take permanent full custody of her grandchildren if Chloe did not go to the courthouse and lie under oath. The silence that followed the end of the recording was absolutely deafening. The heavy, undeniable truth hung in the stale air like a thick, suffocating blanket. Susan had just been exposed as a ruthless, manipulative criminal mastermind in front of a federal judge. Her entire carefully crafted illusion of being a terrified, abused victim was completely shattered into a million jagged pieces. I looked back at the wooden gallery benches. Richard was no longer smirking. His custom-tailored suit looked suddenly too tight across his chest. His face was slick with heavy, nervous sweat. He realized the absolute magnitude of the catastrophe. He realized he had been caught dead to rights participating in grand theft forgery and federal extortion. He slowly stood up from the wooden bench, trying to make himself look as small and invisible as possible. He took a quiet step backward, attempting to silently slip out the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom. The judge saw him move. Her eyes narrowed into tiny, furious slits. She pointed a sharp, trembling finger directly at him from her high wooden bench. She ordered the bailiff to stop that man immediately. She commanded Richard to sit down and not move a single muscle unless he wanted to be tackled to the floor and handcuffed immediately. The heavy-set, armed bailiff stepped directly in front of the exit doors, resting his hand casually on his leather duty belt. Richard froze in place. The absolute, utter humiliation on his face was incredibly satisfying to witness. He slowly sank back down onto the hard wooden bench, burying his sweating face in his shaking hands. He looked like a trapped, pathetic coward. The judge turned her furious, burning gaze back to the plaintiff table. She looked at Susan with a level of profound, absolute disgust I had never seen on another human being's face. The judge picked up the emergency ex parte order Susan had filed just a few days ago. The official legal document where Susan had sworn under the penalty of perjury that I was a violent, abusive monster trying to hide our marital assets. The judge held the thick stack of papers up in the air, her hand shaking with pure judicial rage. She looked Susan dead in the eye and told her she had never witnessed such a repulsive, malicious abuse of the family court system in her entire 30-year career on the bench. The judge stated that Susan had deliberately, intentionally, and maliciously weaponized the legal system to commit massive financial fraud and severe extortion. She told Susan that her disgusting, fabricated claims of physical abuse were an absolute insult to real victims everywhere. The judge slammed her heavy wooden gavel down on the sound block with a loud, violent crack that echoed like a gunshot. She immediately and permanently threw out every single one of Susan's divorce settlement demands. She explicitly revoked the fraudulent commercial lien against my business sale, entirely freeing my $6 million instantly. She formally ordered an immediate total asset freeze on all bank accounts, holding companies and real estate properties connected to Susan and Richard in any way. She declared that the fake religious charity was to be immediately seized and completely dismantled by federal authorities. Then the judge delivered the absolute final crushing blow. She looked down at the court reporter and ordered a full official transcript of the hearing and a certified copy of the audio recordings to be sent directly to the district attorney's office by the end of the day. The judge formally recommended that Susan and Richard be immediately investigated and indicted for felony fraud, criminal forgery, severe federal extortion, and massive intentional court perjury. She told them both to hire the best criminal defense attorneys money could buy because they were going to spend the rest of their natural lives rotting inside a federal penitentiary. Susan physically collapsed. She slumped forward onto the heavy oak table, weeping hysterically and burying her face in her arms. It was not a theatrical performance this time. It was the raw, terrifying realization that her entire life was completely, permanently over. Her slick, corporate lawyers hastily packed their expensive briefcases and literally ran out of the courtroom, leaving her completely alone at the table. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with her toxic radioactive crimes. I sat at the defense table, feeling the immense, crushing weight of the last few months finally lift off my tired, weary shoulders. I let out a long, slow breath of relief. I looked over at the witness box. Chloe was crying softly, but she was smiling. The heavy, suffocating chains her mother had wrapped around her neck were finally completely broken. She was safe. My son-in-law was safe. My beautiful grandchildren were safe. I had successfully dismantled the malicious criminal machine they built to destroy us. The old mechanic had done exactly what he did best. He found the broken, twisted parts, he exposed the hidden damage, and he tore the whole damn thing apart. I stood up from my chair, walked over to the witness box, and wrapped my arms around my brave, wonderful daughter, holding her incredibly tight, as the beautiful sound of absolute righteous justice echoed through the courtroom. The weeks that followed the devastating courtroom hearing moved with a swift and absolute brutal efficiency. When a federal judge formally recommends a criminal investigation based on explicit recorded confessions, the wheels of justice do not turn slowly. The district attorney's office immediately subpoenaed the audio files and launched a massive coordinated strike against Susan and Richard. It was a spectacle of complete and total ruin. Federal agents raided Richard's luxury real estate firm, seizing every single computer server and filing cabinet in the building. They completely dismantled the fake religious charity, freezing the hidden commercial accounts and recovering every single penny of my stolen $400,000. Susan and Richard were formally indicted on a massive list of severe federal charges. They faced counts of felony wire fraud, criminal forgery, money laundering, and severe extortion. The moment the heavy reality of federal prison time set in, the supposed unbreakable bond of their family loyalty completely evaporated. They turned on each other like starving, desperate rats trapped in a sinking ship. Richard was the very first to break. He immediately contacted the federal prosecutors and desperately tried to negotiate a plea deal. He handed over years of private emails and text messages, aggressively claiming that Susan was the true criminal mastermind and that she had emotionally manipulated him into participating in the elaborate heist. Susan retaliated with vicious, absolute panic. She tried to tell the authorities that Richard had forced her to forge my signature and that he was holding the charity money hostage. But the crystal-clear audio recordings we provided completely destroyed her pathetic defense. The prosecutors had them both dead to rights, actively conspiring and laughing about bleeding me entirely dry. Their legal bills skyrocketed, completely draining whatever legitimate personal savings they actually had left. The social destruction was even more profound than their financial ruin. The news of their indictment spread through our small town and our tight-knit church community like a raging wildfire. The women in the church ladies' auxiliary were absolutely horrified to discover that the charity Susan had aggressively promoted was nothing but a malicious criminal shell corporation designed to steal a husband's life savings. Susan was instantly, permanently shunned. The people who used to smile and shake her hand at Sunday service now looked at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. She was entirely stripped of her pristine social standing. She lost her beautiful home, her wealthy friends, and her carefully crafted reputation. She was left facing a long, dark future behind the cold steel bars of a federal penitentiary, completely isolated and utterly disgraced. As for me, the judge was true to her word. The fraudulent commercial lien was entirely revoked, and my remaining $6 million business payout was officially unfrozen and secured in my personal accounts. The divorce was finalized rapidly, with Susan receiving absolutely nothing but the crushing weight of her own legal debts. I was finally completely free. The very first thing I did was drive my rusted pickup truck back to that desolate, overgrown lot. I packed up my few meager belongings, and stepped out of that freezing, damp hunting RV for the absolute last time. I stood in the tall weeds and looked back at the tiny metal box that had been my miserable prison during the darkest, most terrifying months of my entire life. I did not feel any anger as I walked away. I just felt a profound, overwhelming sense of deep, peaceful closure. I drove away, leaving the old camper behind to rust in the dirt. I did not want to move back into the massive suburban house I had shared with Susan. That place was filled with toxic ghosts and hollow memories. I sold it quickly to a nice young family and used a small portion of my newly secured wealth to buy a beautiful, sprawling piece of property out in the quiet, rolling countryside. It had a warm, comfortable ranch-style house with a wide wrap-around porch where I could sit and drink my morning coffee while watching the sun rise over the tall green pines. But the absolute best part of the new property was the massive detached steel garage sitting right behind the main house. It was huge and pristine with high ceilings and heavy concrete floors. I spent weeks outfitting it perfectly. I bought top-of-the-line hydraulic lifts, heavy-duty steel tool chests, and every single specialized wrench and diagnostic machine I could ever possibly need. But this time, it was not a commercial business. I did not have to worry about managing a dozen stressed mechanics balancing massive corporate payrolls or fighting with difficult, angry customers. This was my own private sanctuary. I started buying classic vintage cars at local auctions. I bought a battered 1969 Mustang and a rusted-out classic Chevrolet pickup. I spent my days slowly, patiently bringing those beautiful old machines back to life. I would roll up my sleeves, get grease under my fingernails, and listen to the steady hum of a perfectly tuned engine. It was incredibly therapeutic. Turning a heavy steel wrench was no longer a desperate, grueling task required to survive and pay for Susan's imported furniture. It was a pure labor of love. The rich smell of motor oil and gasoline no longer represented my exhausted, ruined spine. It represented my absolute hard-won freedom, but the true restoration, the healing that genuinely mattered more to me than any amount of money or classic cars, happened within my family. The terrifying blackmail Susan had held over my daughter's head was completely neutralized by the federal prosecutors. Because Chloe had bravely come forward and provided the critical audio evidence exposing the extortion, the authorities formally recognized Mark as an innocent victim of severe coercion. I sat down with Chloe and Mark in my new living room shortly after I bought the property. Mark looked incredibly ashamed and defeated. He kept his head bowed, staring at the floor, as he tearfully apologized for the panicked billing mistake that had almost cost us everything. He told me he was so desperate to keep his medical clinic afloat that he lost his mind for a brief moment. He said he would spend the rest of his life trying to make up for the danger he put our family in. I stopped him right there. I reached across the table and handed him a certified bank check. It was for the exact amount of the medical insurance shortfall, plus enough extra capital to keep his pediatric clinic running smoothly for the next 5 years. I told Mark to take the money to pay off the medical board immediately and to clear his name completely. I told him he was a good man and a wonderful father who had made one bad, panicked choice. I told him we were family, and family absolutely protects each other when the walls start closing in. Mark broke down, weeping openly at the table. He hugged me so hard I thought my ribs were going to crack. He repaid the insurance company the very next morning, clearing his professional license entirely. His medical practice flourished without the suffocating dark cloud of debt hanging over his head. I also sat down with my financial advisor, Robert Sanford, and set up massive, secure, ironclad trust funds for my 2 young grandchildren. I made absolutely certain that their college tuitions, their first homes, and their future security were completely guaranteed. They would never have to worry about struggling to survive in a cold, unforgiving world. I had broken my back for 40 years to build a fortune, and now that fortune was going exactly where it truly belonged. It was going to the people who actually loved me. The emotional bond between Chloe and me grew into something absolutely unbreakable. We had walked through the dark, terrifying fires of betrayal together, and we had survived by trusting each other. Every single Sunday afternoon, Chloe, Mark, and the kids drive out to my property in the country. We do not have fake, stiff barbecues to impress wealthy, condescending neighbors anymore. We grill hot dogs and hamburgers on the back porch, while the kids run laughing through the tall green grass. Chloe sits next to me in the warm afternoon sun, sipping her green tea, and we just watch the world turn. She saved my life by choosing her father over her own safety, and I saved hers by bringing the heavy hammer of justice down on the monsters who threatened her. We are a quiet, happy fortress of unconditional love. When I look back on everything that happened on the 40 years of blind trust and the sudden violent betrayal, I do not feel bitter. I sit in my garage, wiping the dark grease from my hands, and I look at the beautiful, restored engines sitting under the bright lights. I realize that human beings are exactly like the complex machines I have spent my entire life repairing. Sometimes they look absolutely perfect and shiny on the outside, but deep down inside the dark metal, the gears are completely rotten and silently grinding themselves to deadly rusted dust. You can spend a lifetime building a massive, sturdy foundation, but you have to make sure the people standing on it with you are not secretly holding a heavy sledgehammer behind their backs. I learned the hard way that blind devotion is incredibly dangerous if you are giving it to a predator. Trust is something that must be continuously earned through honesty and true sacrifice. But justice is something that must be aggressively fought for. When the engine of your life completely blows out, you cannot just sit on the side of the road and cry about the broken pieces. You have to roll up your sleeves, get underneath the damage, find out exactly what snapped, and rebuild it stronger and better than it ever was before. Have you ever trusted the wrong person and had to fight desperately to get your life back? Let me know your story in the comments below, and please tell me what city and time you are watching from. It warms this old mechanic's heart to know how far this story reaches. If you believe in standing up for what is yours, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next one. See.